appropriate the title we chose for the conference, Trade in Disrupted Times, would be. Let me also note that today is International Women's Day. For the second year in a row, we are doing it virtually because of the pandemic, but next year we plan to resume in person, as we know much of what we get from conferences happens in the corridor or over coffee. Let me begin with thanks to all who have helped us put together today. First of all, the Ad Hoc Advisory Committee, many of whom are also participating today as moderators or panelists. Of course, we cannot do these events without the support of our strategic sponsors, Lockheed Martin Canada and General Dynamics, and our conference sponsors, Amazon, UPS, and the Simon Reisman Chair in International Economic Policy at Carleton University. A word on procedure. If you would like to ask a question during the Q&A portion of the event, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and include your name and affiliation. Use the Q&A function to also comment on questions, as this will help the moderators who will be directing, of course, the procedures. Given our time constraints, we'll be keeping introductions short, but I encourage you to look at the website to learn more about our speakers, moderators, and panelists. Now let's get to business. I'm delighted to again welcome Marie-France Paquette, Chief Economist at Global Affairs Canada, who will set the table for today and provide us with an overview of the facts and figures of trade. So, Marie-France, over to you.
Thank you very much, Colin. Thank you for the introduction. Let me share my screen, and it's going to take a minute to load. Let's see. I am in full mode, so I hope you can see it now.
Perfect.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So thank you for having me once again. Happy International Women's Day to all, with the special thoughts and prayers, of course, for all of those in Ukraine and in neighboring countries doing marvelous job helping out everyone. So special thoughts for those women. So disrupted trade, yes. After COVID, who would have thought? So let me actually start by what I call the elephant in the room, and do speak a bit about disrupted trade in the context of what is happening in Ukraine and in Europe, and that will affect, of course, all over the globe. So as you've seen, the list of sanctions taken by Canada and allies, the US, the EU, UK, and other countries, is changing not on a daily basis, but regularly, with Prime Minister Trudeau announcing further sanctions on individuals yesterday. So we've got sanctions on individuals, sanctions on financial institution, on the central bank, prohibition from using the SWIFT system for international payments, prohibition for docking ships at Canadian ports, airspace, all of that. So lots of different sanctions have been put in place. And another one on Friday that, for those of you interested in trade, is not lost on you. Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, Minister of Finance as well, announced that she was removing the MFN status of Russia, which meant that tariffs would increase by would be applied at 35% rate should there be any goods coming to Canada from Russia. So actually, if you don't have ships that can dock, they can come on different kind of ships, but it's getting harder and harder for Russia to do that because certain shipping companies do not want to take that cargo anymore. But should they come to the country, then of course 35% tariff would be imposed on those goods. So a bundle of sanctions, and we will see in the coming days and weeks, depending on how long this lasts, unfortunately, if more is added by other partners. For now, the MFN, the removal of the MFN status is only has been only applied by Canada, and we will see if other countries or group of countries like the EU will go down that road as well. Of course, it will have some direct business impacts and trade impacts as well, maybe more limited for Canada in terms of direct impacts, given the importance of the trading relationship between Canada and Russia. There's also Ukraine in the picture, of course, that will have an impact on trade, but there will be definitely a lot of indirect impacts on Canada, on the US, and all over the world, and impacts that you have already seen and heard a lot about. Energy prices being one of those that will, of course, feed into supply chain disruptions, further supply chain disruptions, if you will, or increasing costs. and have a direct impact or indirect impact on inflation all over. So it's already interesting in Canada to see that we had very strong growth leading in the fourth quarter of 2021 with inflation rate above 5%. So the Bank of Canada decided to increase its policy rate by 25 basis points last week. But of course, this invasion of Ukraine by Russia was certainly weighing very hard in the balance, right? So we will see how things will evolve in the coming weeks. So different sanctions, but as I said, in terms of direct impacts, smaller direct impacts expected for Canada, given the size of a trading relationship between the two countries. So on the left-hand side, you've got merchandise trade. So what you can see is Canada's export to Russia was about 656 million in 2021. That's the red line. And of course, imports were a bit higher, above $2 billion. And in terms of services, 275 million of Canadian services exports to Russia. Okay, so and in terms of exports, it's about what 0.1% of our exports. So it's a small trading relationship, if you will, if you compare to any other trading partners for Canada. So let me go back here. So if we look at Russia, so in terms of, as a market for our exports, it's not as important, but in terms of imports, so be it for merchandise or services, actually, it is a bit more important in terms of supply. So what do we get out of Russia? And we import like 2.1 billion, like I said, of imports from Russia. So it's a bit asymmetric in that sense, if you will, okay? So what do we export to Russia? So of course, this is kind of interesting because the top 5 at the HS6 level digit. So we've got 2 different categories of airplanes. But if you look at the imports from Russia, they don't come from Canada. If you were to do it the other way around, they don't report that because those aircrafts coming from Canada are imported through a third country. So sometimes, it's interesting to look at both sides of the same medal. And then you've got dog and cat food, which is a very important export of Canada to Russia. And we've already have seen in the past few months some phytosanitary measures being put in place where Russia was demanding that Canada provide more information in terms of OGM and things like that. So different kind of paperwork, and was like, okay, interesting. This was already kind of getting a bit more difficult. In terms of imports, so urea is the top import, which is actually used in the fertilizer and for other chemical products. So that's something important. And palladium that you'll see down below as a semi-manufactured good is actually used in catalytic converters for cars. So, and of course, petroleum and light oil. So that's not a surprise either. Okay, in terms of foreign direct investment, so we have, a decrease over the past, let's say, 10 years in terms of Canadian direct investment into Russia, as Canadian companies were a bit more way of doing business over there, and about just under, $2 billion of Russian FDI into Canada in terms of stock, okay? And the number of companies doing business, so you see that, of course, in Canada, we have majority of small and medium-sized enterprises, and we have about 840 companies that did export to Russia in 2020. Okay? And of course, the small proportion being large companies. So as I said, so direct impacts and indirect impacts to be expected. Some of them, we already see them quite, drastically, the changes and the anticipation and all the uncertainty around oil and gas actually coming out of Russia. So we see the difference in prices in terms of 7-day percentage change and the percentage change since January. So drastic increases for not only oil and gas, but a lot of metals. Like if you look at palladium, which is one of the imports that is important for Canada coming out of Russia, and we see a good increase in prices there, and that will no doubt have an impact on other supply, right? So Russia is the 11th largest economy in the world, and it's a very important, of course, market and supply for many European countries and for Asia as well. Okay? And the discussion about should we or should we not block imports of oil and gas from Russia, that's of course a very difficult decision for European partners in this. Okay. There's also Ukraine, of course, in the picture, because as you know, this will have significant disruptions probably for years to come. So what is it that we import normally from Ukraine? Sunflower seed, semi-finished iron, and non-alloyed pig iron, so different kind of iron, if you will, passenger vehicle, apple juice, things like that. So, and of course, Ukraine, as you know, is a big supply of corn, sunflower seed oil for other countries as well, wheat, and Russia is a big exporter of wheat as well. So in that particular case, it will have an impact on Canada, a very different one in this case, because we might have other companies or countries interested in supplying wheat from Canada, but we would not be in a position probably to respond to all of that excess demand, if you will, suddenly. Okay, so we'll see as things evolve, as I say, and then of course we'll have just in a minute, I'll show you the potential impact on the GDP of this crisis in Ukraine. Okay, so as we went through the pandemic, okay, so you see the dips in terms of world trade, in terms of world production in 2020. So the V shape with a good rebound coming out at the end of the summer, if you will, in 2020. And as you've seen, the dotted line is actually the number of cases per million, like a monthly average throughout the world, so global cases of COVID. And you see the different waves happening around the world, and you see that actually the world trade and production has been able to held up pretty steadily. And then we see the big Omicron wave in the fall of 2021 with, we think, when we're going to get the data to see that we won't see a huge dip, of course. And in Canada, in the States, the economy is doing quite good. So there's no reason to think that it will have a major impact. So it's interesting to see that, yes, the first wave everywhere, all the countries were affected. We rebounded quite quickly in terms of economic and trade. And now, of course, the different waves have less impact, if you will, on that front. So this is what I was mentioning. So this is Oxford Economics, who have they've looked at their forecasts and they said, what do we think if there's let's say, a quick invasion of Russia? Those are the blue bars. And what you see here is an impact in terms of a change with respect to the GDP levels in Russia, if you have a conflict compared to a baseline of 2023, that doesn't last too long. Those are the blue bars, okay? So you see the impact on the Eurozone, United Kingdom, and the world. And if the conflict were to last a lot longer, of course, as you can imagine, then they anticipate that this would mean much further disruptions in terms of impact on GDP for Russia. And for the world, it means about a decrease of 1.1% in terms of level of GDP compared to a baseline of 2020. Okay, so still significant. And this, according to them, is not even the worst case scenario. So they have other numbers that they're still looking at. And I'm sure that other institutions are doing exactly the same in terms of how best to internalize or take into account what is happening and all the ripple effects of, energy on supply chains and other things, and the impacts that it will have in terms of trade and the economy, the global economy. Okay, so for us at the Global Affairs, of course, we look at what has happened during the pandemic, and we take a longer view here. And we were saddened to see that, as you can see here, that the red line is actually the number of people living in extreme poverty, which is less than $2 a day worldwide. And there was clearly a good downward trend for the past 30 years almost. And what we've seen is that the estimate is based on the impact of COVID, and it will push up people into extreme poverty with an additional almost 100 million people going into extreme poverty because of COVID. So it's sad to see that has a big impact worldwide. And of course now we have the issue that is happening in Ukraine that will be lasting for many years. So it will have other ripple effects as well. Okay. So for the Canadian economy, as you know, the numbers were pretty good in the fourth quarter of 2021. The economy rebounded very strongly in Canada. Same thing in the US, actually. So what you see here, the red line is the US. So if you compare to pre-pandemic, so indexed to 100 in 2019, so just before the pandemic, and this is the kind of the the expected rebound, if you will. So US is definitely above pre-pandemic level, and Canada and the dotted red line is just behind the US in terms of its vigor. So we're doing good. And of course, that is what we see, global impacts on aggregate demands and therefore on inflation as well. So we've had a good recovery, yes, but quite uneven across sectors. So I'm sure you've seen that quite a few times. So these are the updated numbers. So the red bar is February to April 2020, and the blue bar is the cumulative change between February 2020 and December 2021, of the longer time series that we have for sectors. And what you see, of course, is that some of the blue bars are rebounding. So a good growth there in terms of GDP per sector. But some of the bars are still, the red bars are still pretty, were dramatic. Let's say accommodation and food services. The blue bar is an improvement, but it's still minus 10% compared to pre-pandemic levels. Okay, so not all sectors have been able to benefit from this economic rebound. As we ease up restrictions right now in the country and elsewhere, we could hope for the best, of course, for both the accommodation and food services, arts, entertainment, recreation sectors that should be able to pick up some pace, and of course manufacturing. But manufacturing we see other impacts of supply chain disruptions, of course, having different indirect effects here as well. So in terms of goods trade for Canada, so on the left-hand side, you've got the goods, on the right-hand side, the services. So both exports and imports of goods are pre-pandemic levels. So you see the deep V at the beginning of the pandemic and the rebound quite soon thereafter. And if you look, you can see a positive trend there. So in terms of exports, 22% above pre-pandemic levels. So that's really nice to see, and 15% in terms of imports. However, of course, on the services side, you see the big drop in both exports and imports, and you don't quite see, you see a steady increase, we hope, for services, but we're still below 16% in terms of imports of services and 0.2% in terms of exports. So almost there on the export of services side of things. Now, one of our economists, Colin Scarf, has looked into this rebound in terms of trade, saying, okay, numbers look good. This is quite interesting. So the red line here represents the value, okay? And what he has done is decompose this value in terms of a price effect and a quantity effect. And what you see is when you have actually the red bar above zero, so the change compared to 2019, the pre-pandemic level, you see that it's a positive change, so that's great. So as we went into the fall of 2021, but it is mostly, it's coming actually exclusively because of a price effect. So actually the quantities are lower in terms of what we export, but in terms of the price, because it has increased so much, it more than compensates for the lack in quantity, and we have therefore a positive value. Okay, so it's a price story more than a quantity story. So it will be interesting to see in the coming months if this holds or things stabilize. As you can see, the purple bars tend to be a bit smaller than negative. It's a drag on the total value of exports. And hopefully, right, for 2022, 2023, that there will be a reversal and we'll have the value of export being affected positively both by prices and quantities in that case, hopefully. And of course, the goods exports have surpassed pre-pandemic levels with major trading partners. So we're catching up. So of course, initially, the US being our main trading partner was a big, big drag on Canadian goods exports from February to April 2020. And of course, now we've been more than, we've been catching up, which is very good. So there's only actually China, if you look, right, both the red and the blue bars are in the positive for the two period, right? So that's the only case in which there hasn't been a drag initially at the beginning of the pandemic. So let's talk a tidbit about diversification. Of course, I don't need to tell you a lot about it. I am sure you're very familiar. There's many good reasons why we would want to diversify. Hedge the risk, of course, right? And we want to benefit from being in places with, faster growth rate, potential growth rate in terms of, let's say, Asian markets, for example, right? And we want to be working using our trade commissioner service to work with Canadian companies to tap into different markets, maybe with the same products, maybe with different products within the same company, and so on. So we definitely have been working with them for more than 100 years now, and we will continue to do so. and try to help them diversify. So what we want to do basically is when we find companies, for example, most of the companies, as you know, they start with the US market, right? They tap into US market, which is a difficult market, one might say, right? It is not an easy one. And once they're successful there after a few years, then we want to tell, our trade commission is saying, go see those companies and use the tools we have internally, and then try to assess if there are other markets where these products or services could be, very well received and could do well. So this is one way to use the trade commissioners to say, okay, you've been there 3 years, 4 years, 5 years in the States. We think that Europe could be your next stop. These are the countries we think your product could have some, good legs, or in Asia, for example, whatever the country, and then try to help diversify this. Okay, so we had set a target, the government set a target back in 2017 about reaching an increase of Canadian exports, non-US, okay, that's the overseas, my overseas definitions, non-US, so an increase by 50% by 2025. So before the pandemic, I thought, this is coming fast. And now I'm thinking, oh dear. So no one will hold us accountable. I think that it's a major problem if we don't meet the target. But of course, the idea of diversification is even more important now than it ever was. I think that's the main message here. And when we look at, so the blue line, the dotted blue line tells you the target, 292 billion by 2025. The purple slotted line is where we stand. So right now we're at 216. So we're short about, some $30 billion in terms of reaching a target for this year. And then as we see the forecasts, and these forecasts are coming from the Conference Board of Canada, and they've just been updated. And it seems like we would be actually in the coming years in a good trajectory to kind of catch up, okay? Like I said, the target in itself, I don't think anyone will say, oh, you're a few $1 billion short, it's not good. It's just that we should still strive to diversify of export because it makes sense for Canada, it makes sense for our business, okay? As you know, we've got a very wide network of FTA that allows our companies and companies from abroad establishing themselves in Canada to get access to this beautiful network of 15 FTAs that cover, 51 different countries, 1.5 billion consumers, and it's almost like 2/3 of the world's GDP. Okay, so that's always one point that we use in talking to potential investors and say, if you establish here, you've got access to a huge network of FTAs. And let me say just a few words in terms of CUSMA and the tariff utilization rate preferences. So we were interested in seeing, because there was a lot of talk, as you know, about the different rules of origin, the changes in particular in the automotive sector. So what you see here is blue bars, half of 2020, so that's the NAFTA. The purple bar is the first 6 months of CUSMA in 2020. And the red bar is the first 6 months of 2021, okay? So if you look on the left-hand side, what you see, my apologies, is actually that in terms of exports, okay, for all products, not a huge differences. It's a bit kind of, I wonder when I see numbers kind of going down for the first 6 months of 2021, but there's still plenty of months in the year, but definitely not a big change overall between NAFTA and CUSMA initially. Okay, so that's the first thing. And second thing is in the automotive sector, there's not been a big difference here. So that's very, very interesting to see. On the import side is a bit, a slight decrease for all products going from 85 to 82 back to 82.7. So I think, time will tell. Companies have a few years, I think 3 or 4 years to go back and claim preferences. So if a company is not sure if they meet the threshold of the new rule of origin, they can just pay the MFN rate, right? Forego the tariff preferences, and later assess and say, oh, I did qualify, can go back and claim backwards the preferences. So this will evolve as we revise the data in the coming years, but I don't think that the fear we had around the new rules of origin is materializing, which of course is good news in itself, okay? And in terms of using the tariff preferences under CETA, what you see is in terms of Canadian export to the EU, we've got constant growth in terms of utilization from 52 to 57%. So we don't have the data yet for 2021. We should have that in the spring, a bit later. And in terms of imports, going from 38% to 56%. So But this is good. There's still room, for improvement. Definitely, we've got other trade agreements, let's say with Korea, where we can reach, 75, 80%. So overall rates. So there's still, work to do, working with our companies in Canada, in the EU, like on both sides of the Atlantic, to say, hey, we've got this fantastic trade deal. You'd better try to take advantage of it because it gives you, of course, an edge. Okay. An average always will be hiding different things. So what you see here is actually great variation in terms of overall utilization of preferences. Okay. Denmark, for example, will have 86.5% utilization rate, but in Spain we'll have just under 36. So there's great variation within European countries in terms of Canadian exports and on the import side as well. So there's definitely a lot more work to be done working with companies on both sides. Okay, so let me leave you with three big challenges and questions, if I can put it like that, in terms of when we talk about disrupted trade. So we've had COVID, now we have this situation in Ukraine, and we'll have, important indirect effects, and probably for years to come, unfortunately. But here is actually, this is coming out of St. Gallen University. So Professor Agnew and his team, they're kind of gathering some information that's quite interesting. And these are the number of trade-distorting policies and intervention. The red ones are, of course, the ones that are harmful, and there could be some good ones, so liberalizing policies. But overall, you see that even before the pandemic, there was definitely a trend upwards in terms of the use of harmful, distorting trade policy intervention. Right? And it's not just in the agricultural sector. It is actually, and not only in time of crisis, because you can see that the upward trend before the pandemic. Of course, China, EU, US, they represent about 60% of those global subsidies. And Canada is, of course, it means that we're facing these, and it's definitely a big challenge for our company. The second thing is food for thought is actually the reality is that Canadian export has been losing market share around the world. Okay, so if you look at the graph, so before actually 1998, it was kind of wobbling around the same level for quite some time, but we see here a decrease. That's interesting, a bit puzzling. 2001 is when China, accessed WTO and kind of tapped into the world markets in this way. So yes, it could be one explanation, but there could be other ones. And again, the idea of diversification here. Of course, we could increase our share of world trade by exporting more to the US. That's definitely one way to do it. But by diversifying, allowing our companies to tap into more market, if there's potential for growth there, then of course that could help eventually in terms of increasing the share of world trade. And lastly, is a long-term view again, going back to 2000, and try to first see different periods here. So you've got the pre-global financial crisis, okay, where we have about 6% growth in terms of world trade volume. You see the dip in the global financial crisis. After that, a long period of expansion, but with a growth rate that was much smaller, 2.5%, right? And if you recall, actually, if you can think back, before the beginning of the pandemic, end of 2019, and even like January, February of 2020, international organizations were kind of downgrading their forecast in terms of, trade and the economy and whatnot. We were kind of bracing ourselves for a recession, which turned out to be a health crisis, pandemic, and then, of course, a global crisis. So, of course, it remains to be seen what will be the case after the pandemic. And now we have, of course, again, this situation in Ukraine that is adding another wild card here in terms of what will be the situation after that. So we probably have a few years of good growth in some places, even with the events in Ukraine. Oxford Economics was forecasting a growth rate worldwide at about 3% of GDP, global GDP. Right, so we'll see what the period looks like coming out of the situation. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
for thought and a lot of questions going forward, particularly when it comes to market share and things. I should just tell the audience that the slides that Marie-France has presented to us will be available on the CGI website, and I would encourage you to look at them because there is, as Marie-France said, there is much there. It's a content rich, and it does set the table for today. And now I'm delighted to say that we're going to have a message from our new Deputy Minister for International Trade, David Morrison, who in a pre-recorded message to us is going to complete the laying of the table that Marie-France has begun.
Aujourd'hui est l'Institut canadien des affaires mondiales pour discuter du commerce international. I know my predecessors have often participated in this event, and I would have loved to have been able to join you in person. I was in fact a bit reluctant to join you in this pre-recorded fashion, but Colin was his usual persuasive self, and I generally find that my life works out much better when I do exactly what Colin tells me to do. Let me begin by thanking Marie-France for setting the scene with facts and figures about trade. Those numbers will help put my remarks, and I hope the discussion that follows, into context. Let me also acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. The theme of this conference, Doing Trade in Disruptive Times, perfectly summarizes some of the challenges Canada and its major trading partners are currently facing. I think of these challenges, these disruptions, as either acute or chronic. In terms of acute challenges, we don't have to look any further than what is happening in Ukraine. The invasion launched by President Putin on February 24th and our response to it are creating economic shocks that are, of course, already leading to disruptions in our global trading system. This is, of course, on top of the earlier acute shock of the COVID-19 pandemic, which also brought significant disruptions to Canada's international trade. The pandemic put new strains on international supply chains and forced businesses to adapt. In terms of chronic challenges, I would point to the rise of a major non-market economy that does not seem to consider itself bound by internationally agreed trading rules. Here, I'm of course referring to China. I think it's fair to say that the rise of China and its approach to trade will present challenges for Canada and its partners for the foreseeable future. So these are the kinds of disruptions, both acute and chronic, that come to mind when I think about doing business in disrupted times. But the question then quickly becomes, what can a country like Canada do about such disruptions? First, I think it's important to remind ourselves that we have some real strengths, and that one of our greatest is our trading relationship with the United States. Canada's Trade Minister, Mary Ng, also known as my boss, recently delivered a speech at the Wilson Center in Washington, in which she outlined the strength of Canada's relationship with the United States. Minister Ng pointed out that last year, Canada and the United States set new records for mutual cross-border trade. In 2021, Canada's exports to the US surpassed $450 billion for the first time. Our imports from the United States approached all-time highs of nearly $300 billion. Even if, as Marie-France has likely already pointed out to you, growth was driven by prices rather than quantity, it is still quite remarkable coming out of our pandemic. Our free trade partnership with the US is also key to reinforcing the security of some of our most critical supply chains. Strengthening supply chains is in fact an important part of the roadmap for a renewed US-Canada partnership, which just had its first anniversary. We're also doing this through the Canada-US Working Group on Supply Chains announced by Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden at the North American Leaders Summit last November, with a special focus on key sectors such as public health and critical minerals. So in terms of strengths, one has to go first to our trading relationship with the US. Of course, there are irritants in the relationship from time to time, and some of these garner considerable publicity. But that doesn't change the fact that almost all of Canada-US trade functions exceptionally well for both countries. Second, our efforts at trade diversification. Franz has already given some data on this, including how CETA is a particularly bright spot. Companies on both sides of the Atlantic are clearly taking advantage of what CETA has to offer. In addition, we are redoubling our efforts to ensure Canadian companies take full advantage of Canada's other free trade agreements around the world. This is, of course, a key priority for our Trade Commissioner Service. Continuing on this theme of diversification, many of you will know we are now in the initial stages of free trade negotiations with Indonesia and separately with the larger group of ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, all as part of our developing Indo-Pacific strategy. Our recent announcement of FIPA negotiations with Taiwan is also part of this effort. The third thing we are doing to cope with the current disruptions is to double down on our work to strengthen the rules-based trading system in support of free and open markets so that Canadian businesses can focus on scaling up, exporting, and continuing to thrive in the global economy. We continue to engage our international partners, including in the G20, APEC, ASEAN, and the WTO, to make supply chains more resilient, minimize trade restrictions, and strengthen and diversify trade relationships. Minister Ng and other like-minded trade leaders remain committed to their work with the Ottawa Group on WTO reform, and we are all looking forward to the upcoming ministerial conference, which has now been scheduled for June in Geneva. Finally, building back better and diversifying trade is about more than just where we trade and what we trade. It is also about who trades. We need to support a recovery that is sustainable, responsible, and inclusive, one that helps everyone to benefit from trade, including women and other traditionally underrepresented groups. We know, for example, that Canada could add up to $150 billion to our economy by 2026 by ensuring the full and equal inclusion of women. That's why it's a priority for Canada to support women entrepreneurs to start up, scale up, and export to new markets. We're working closely with Canadian exporters to help them take advantage of our free trade agreements and preferential access to 2/3 of the global economy and markets covering over 1.5 billion consumers. We're the only G7 country to have a comprehensive free trade agreement with all the other G7 countries, and we're very proud of it. These agreements with the US, with the EU, and in the Indo-Pacific region are bridges for Canadian companies to reach new markets worldwide. Even in the face of disruptive times, I look forward to continuing our work to build a path to economic recovery and prosperity. Thank you, merci, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
My thanks to David Morrison, who, like his predecessors, first Tim Sargent and John Hannaford, have been highly supportive of these annual State of Trade conferences. And once again, a message that sets out the stage for what we're going to discuss today and is a perfect complement to what we just heard from Marie-France Paquette in the outline of the facts and figures of trade. Now let's get into our panels, and I'm going to invite Mark Agnew, Sarah Goldfeder, Victor Gomez to join moderator Adriana Vega, who will lead the discussion on e-commerce and digital trade. What is Canada missing? So over to you, Adriana, and the panel.
Thank you, Colin. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us to this year's annual State of Trade Conference, Doing Trade in Disrupted Times. My name is Adriana Vega, and I will have the pleasure of moderating our first panel today, which will be discussing e-commerce and digital trade. What is Canada missing? First off, I'd like to thank the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, CGAI, for hosting us today, for putting this event together. And congratulations to you, Colin, to the team at CGAI for your continued work over the last couple of years, convening these important policy discussions even though we've had to do them virtually for a little longer than we had hoped. And as you said earlier, Colin, I look forward to meeting in person again soon. So to kick off the program today, I want to give a warm welcome to my fellow panelists here. I'm very happy to see you, happy to have this important conversation on digital trade, which I know we all care about very much, as you already wisely mentioned, Sarah. And I'd like to welcome Mark Agnew, who is Senior Vice President of Policy and Government Relations at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Sarah Goldfeder, Manager of Government Relations at General Motors, Victor Gomez, Assistant Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs at Sun Life Financial. And Mark, I'm going to kick things off with you today. I think looking back at the last couple of years and all the things that we've had to do to adapt to living in this pandemic, and as I said, much longer than we had initially thought, the digital element, I think, is the one that's, stands out the most among all the things that we've had to adapt, whether it is work or, consuming or individual choices as consumers. We're definitely engaging a lot more virtually. We are buying more things virtually, whether that's products or services, whether it is local or internationally. And that kind of collective of individual decisions to engage more digitally has impacts on how business is conducted and all this sort of like infrastructure and framework that goes on behind the scenes, whether that is, you buy more online, there's more of your data online, where does that data go? Or, payments infrastructure, like all these things that perhaps are not so evident to the consumer, but they definitely are happening behind the scenes. And that evidently has implications for policymakers as well. How do we deal with this rapid acceleration of what maybe was already coming, but now it's just happening a lot faster. And in some cases, it's already here. So, for those of us who maybe have not been watching so closely, can you situate us on where we're at today in terms of that policy framework that I was just discussing? What's happening in Canada that we may have missed over the last couple of years?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Adriana. And I should say, it's funny you talk about being together in person. And I know when we were having our prep call last week, we were talking about the last in-person State of Trade conference, which was sort of the final act before we all got locked down. Every time someone coughed in their hand, people were staring at them cockeyed. So, fond memories of this conference. And so hopefully next year we can do it in person. But as I was thinking about digital trade over the last 2 years, in some ways, it's kind of that proverbial, like, it's been the best of times, but the worst of times. And so, like, what I mean by that is, like, the best of times in the sense of we've never had more attention on, like, digital economy issues in the broadest sense of the word. And I think, like, for us that are in the public policy world as, digital trade geeks, like, that's really exciting, really exhilarating. But it's been the worst of times in the sense of progress being, like, glacially slow on things. And so, people have been talking a lot, for instance, about the digital charter. This is something that the previous industry minister started, very much, I think, a legacy item that he saw. And, the signature bit of legislation coming out of that was an update to Canada's, privacy rules. And I know we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail later, but, just to say at the top, over 20 years out of date and long overdue for an update. But the legislation it seems stuck. We had it tabled in the last parliament, not really going anywhere. It seems in this parliament anytime soon. And so that is sort of one example. We've also had various digital policy proposals coming out of Heritage Canada, our cultural Ministry. Are they aligned with all of our USMCA commitments? Maybe yes, maybe no. So that's been another, friction point. Our government's talked a lot about the DIPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement that involves Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile. Again, we've been consulting on this. We've been exploring for a little while, seem to be still exploring for a little time yet to come. And so again, like, lots of talk, but, not really that firm, like, let's actually kind of get stuff done. One of the areas where we actually have seen progress happening, I think much to the chagrin of people on the industry side, has been around digital services taxation. We had a global multilateral deal that the OECD managed to land last October. Certainly, from the Canadian Chamber perspective, we were happy to see that. No one wants to see a patchwork of tax rules coming up, but one single global rule book. But unfortunately, here in Canada, we're still pressing ahead with a unilateral digital services tax that would have Canada striking it out on its own, potentially with a retroactive application. And again, I can talk about that in more detail, but that's an example of where we're trying to all move together in global unison, and we're kind of charting out our own path that is going to ultimately make it more complicated for businesses. And I can kind of talk about other various things like this digital policy task force, for instance, that was in the government's electoral platform, as well as in the Industry Canada mandate letter. Is that going to do something? Is it not? Remains to be seen. But the common theme, I think, through all of this is that there's no digital trade strategy, no coherent approach. And I get how people outside of the Ottawa bubble kind of roll their eyes when they hear policy wonks like us talking about strategies, but I think strategies do actually serve a genuinely useful function in that it helps to galvanize what is an otherwise series of disparate silos within the government bureaucracy and within the government machinery, and help to give some focus to it. Government is complicated, policy making is complicated and messy, and I think having a coherent approach is something that has really been missing from our digital discussion over the last number of years, because again, as you've seen from just what I've talked about over the last few minutes, it's just a series of seemingly random things together with no common unifying narrative or thread.
Thank you, Mark. And I was actually trying not to think back to that day 2 years ago at this very conference, but I'm happy you brought it up, because yes, it was the last conference that I personally attended to before COVID, so it will forever exist in our collective memories, I think. Thank you for that overview of where we're situated. It's not necessarily a great picture that you're portraying, but it is encouraging, I think, to see that some things, or at least there's an awareness that something needs to happen, right? So, Victor, I'm gonna move to you right now, and like Mark already kind of painted a picture of where we're at today on the domestic side, and I think he made that point around if we chart our own path, that can actually pose challenges for businesses that are actually engaging in trade internationally. So can you tell us a little more from a perspective, what is the rest of the world doing? What's happening out there that we need to take into consideration in terms of policy making?
Yeah, thanks, Adriana, and thanks to the Canadian Global Affairs Institute for this opportunity to talk about this issue. Love talking about digital trade, obviously. I think I'm the only one on this panel currently that is not in Ottawa, as far as I know. But nevertheless, I do share all of your inherent wonkishness, so happy to be here. So Sun Life, as most of you will know, is one of the largest life and health insurers in Canada. We're also a major asset manager with 1.3 trillion in assets under management. And I guess the final thing I'd say is maybe not as many people realize that we're not just in Canada and the United States, but we're also in several markets in Asia, including China and India, the big ones, as well as an infrastructure investor around the globe, quite literally. So we have this view that is global, as Adriana said. And like all companies, we were digitizing before the pandemic, of course, because that's the way the world's going. But we also obviously ramped this up with COVID, providing digital services to our clients who were at home, stuck at home, digital wealth management advice, other sort of digital health services and things like that. And that'll continue, of course. And so we see this through a digital lens, but also globally. And I guess I would say in terms of global trends, there's like basically two contradictory trends that we're seeing in the world of data, which is fundamental to e-commerce. Right? With e-commerce, what are you doing? You're sending data around, right? And so one is a sort of a negative trend where there's an inward lookingness that governments are undertaking to like localize data, to create data governance rules nationally. And we're seeing that proliferate, right? There were hundreds of data measures, more than 300, I think, last year. And a lot of that is to do with attempts by governments to localize data, to keep it within their borders. For various reasons that I'll get into. A contradictory trend, though, on the optimistic side, from our vantage point, is an attempt by countries to come together and create global rules around data to ensure those data flows can happen between countries in a secure way. So dive into it a little bit. Why are policymakers moving so quick and so aggressively on data governance nationally. Well, some of the concerns that they raise are, legitimate concerns around privacy and security of their citizens' data, right? And then access to data, the related thing of access to data by national regulators. So the notion is that if you force companies to hold data on servers within the country, it's somehow more secure because it's there, physically there. Sort of a weird way of thinking about data, almost like money in a vault somewhere, which, as we know, is not the case. Another, sometimes unspoken policy aim with these kinds of national localization rules for data are an attempt to create an indigenous sort of a national data economy for around data storage, and that, again, just age-old protectionism as the sort of trade policy wonks on this call will recognize. But why are they? So I think, aside from being protectionist, we think that these sort of policy approaches are a misunderstanding of data and how it works in a modern economy. First of all, on the security side, I don't need to tell anybody on this call that cybersecurity is a global problem, right? Hackers aren't just sitting there trying to hack, sitting in Lower Town hacking things in Centertown. They're actually, operating globally, and the networks are sophisticated, increasingly sophisticated. It's not an exaggeration to say there's a cyber war going on where individual groups, non-state actors, and state actors are engaging in cybersecurity attacks. We see millions of them on a weekly basis. And so the notion that you can concentrate your data within the borders of your country, and that it'll be safer, is actually counterintuitive because it's concentration risk, right? Whereas the cloud service providers, public cloud, that increasingly companies like ours are using, but also SMEs are using because it's rather affordable to store your data that way, uses scale right across multiple countries. Cloud service providers tend to be large global firms, and they use, for example, failover redundancy storage, right? So if there's an attack in one geography, it can move it to another geography. And so protect the stability and security of the network that way. So, and also because they're global, they have access to global talent, right? And we're always talking about digital talent is scarce. It's hard to find people that do AI, that do machine learning, that understand data. And these firms have access to them, and they can provide access to a firm that's even not to a firm like ours, but also to an SME in a country, can gain access to state-of-the-art cybersecurity and cloud-based storage services, right? And I don't need to tell this group that trade barriers reduce economic growth, right? So the OECD's done tons of studies that digital connectivity increases trade, and barriers like the ones I'm talking about decrease trade and therefore growth. Luckily, and I'll just be quick with this, Mark alluded to some of this, there's a counter move, and I think some of this nervousness that you're seeing governments engage in is because there aren't those global rules. We don't have global rules for trade and e-commerce and for data flows. So there's attempts for the joint statement initiative at the WTO is working on e-commerce, moving slowly. Hopefully it'll pick up. Canada's part of that. Hopefully this year they'll be able to make some good progress. The DIPA that Mark referenced came out of the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement between Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile. So these are all pieces, right? And we know that USMCA, known as CUSMA here, it also has a chapter in that. CPTPP does as well. So these are different pieces coming together, hopefully, towards an open, rules-based, global sort of framework for trade and data flows around the economy. So I'll end on that optimistic note and pass it back to Adriana. Thanks.
You need to unmute, Adriana.
Great. Someone had to do it on this panel, right? So Victor, I'm glad that you mentioned the USMCA, because as you were saying, the sense of urgency around, coming up with rules is because there are no global rules. The thing that kind of popped up in my mind was the whole USMCA, right? There's no global rules, but there's some attempts at building, or at least beginning to create that kind of set of rules. And, Sarah, you and I were quite involved in the whole USMCA, what feels like an age ago, and those negotiations, that kind of conversation. And before that, the CPTPP or the TPP even. So, from your perspective, you work in a quintessential North American manufacturing industry. You have a great line of sight into what the USMCA does, what it does differently from NAFTA. So can you tell us more about, in this particular space, how far does USMCA go? Does it, is it actually doing the job that it's meant to do, to enable these value chains from a digital perspective? And do you think there's more that needs to be done in that space?
Thank you, Adriana. I think, one of the things we have to agreements is that the trade agreements are built to facilitate trade, to enable trade. They don't actually do trade, right? Companies trade. And so, to answer the question, has the USMCA done enough on digital trade? I think I kind of go back to this kind of laundry list of different pieces, as Victor noted, of policy that any company has to navigate, even within just the North American sector. And so it becomes something that you need multiple experts kind of charting your course and who have that capacity. That's not a problem. You just, you build another division, you build another, suite of cubicles and put a bunch of people in there that can kind of chart your way through all of these pieces and policies, make sense of what it is that you need to do and what you can leverage where. And so the USMCA does what it does well for the North American context, but the reality is that most companies that use the digital trade provisions within USMCA are looking globally. And so while it does do some things to kind of facilitate overall trade, I think in the end, it's on the individual countries themselves to actually follow through and enable some of this. And so I think so in that way, is it a good move? It's a great move. It's a great move because it provided a template, right? So TPP in the drafting of that agreement before the redrafting of NAFTA was really a leader in that. And the entire intent behind TPP was to give a bit of a blueprint to the world on how to do a modern trade agreement. And so the fact that the US administration at least held on to that notion when they decided to renegotiate NAFTA and create the USMCA is really valuable because it provides some protection against data localization, for example, and it provides, some enabling features that facilitate the trade of data. But for so long, all of our thought on trade, like we divided trade and we quantify trade in commodities and manufactured goods and less so in services and definitely not in data. So we don't actually have a good notion of how much data is globally traded at any moment in time. And I think that is one of the areas that USMCA doesn't do anything for that. And it also, provides somewhat of an idea on how to measure services. But until we really understand what the global quantification of trade and data actually looks like, I think it's going to be hard to gain traction in the individual governments. And so I think, it's important more than ever now, because as we see in the auto sector transition, for example, auto OEMs are no longer just, they're also about, again, those data flows. And so all of the big OEMs have looked to identify how do we quantify and create revenue streams out of these data flows that we're creating out of our vehicles. And beyond that, creating new divisions within companies that are focused on digital trade, essentially. And so it's, when you think now about digital trade, it's not just about digital services, financial services, kind of those intangibles that, that we talk about sometimes in the Canadian economy. It's going back to basics. It is part of agriculture. It is part of commodity trading. It is part of manufacturing. And so it's harder and harder to carve it out as a distinct area of trade. And while that may be beneficial in the long run, it also makes it more complicated.
That's very interesting, Sarah. And I feel like what I'm hearing, just based on how this conversation is moving along, it just really underscores the need for cooperation, right? Because there's an element of global creating global standards, but driven by individual governments, based on what their industries are asking them to do. And that ultimately, before we end up with a patchwork of regulations like we tend to do, that just really calls for even stronger cooperation with a bit of a sense of urgency. So on that note, Mark, thinking about cooperation, thinking about talking to our peers in different industries with different, industries in different countries, what are some of the initiatives, whether from government or business, that you think might help move the needle on some of these issues? What's the low-hanging fruit out there?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different items, and the first one that comes to mind is actually picking up on something that Sarah said around the coordination and the collaboration piece. We have a pretty weak muscle reflex when it comes to Fed-Prov coordination at the best of times in this country, as we all know, let alone in the digital economy space. And so if we look at what's been happening, for instance, with Quebec and Bill 64, Ontario was kind of doing its little thing on privacy for a bit last year. There is no, and I used the word strategy earlier, so now I'm going to use the word table. There's no real table that seems to have the federal data people and the provincial data people, from a policy standpoint, not a regulator standpoint, but the policy folks thinking about how do we coordinate amongst 13 subnationals in one federal jurisdiction to have a coherent domestic approach to this. And I should say, by the way, it needs to be federally led. And the reason why I think that is so important in this case is because there are such big international implications that if you have provinces all kind of flailing around doing their own thing without the feds actually taking a real leadership role, we're not going to be able to do the international piece, certainly. And that sort of builds on what I think is the second thing is the international, piece, and how do we leverage that global coherence? There's a risk with reinventing the wheel and thinking that we need to reconcoct digital trade chapters. But I mean, anyone who spent even a fraction of time looking at trade agreements, if you were to put all these things side by side, they look eerily similar. So much so that university profs would think there was some plagiarism ring going on. But that's kind of the whole point in trade policy. Everything builds on what came before, very intentionally. And so to me, you have the CPTPP. It has a built-in expansion mechanism with also a built-in mandate to expand. And I think if you're talking about the region of the world that Victor's company operates in, you should be leveraging that as a tool to enforce domestic reforms on countries to get them to modernize their data rules to a standard that makes it sensible for business to operate and to have a business-friendly environment. The other piece of it too, we didn't talk about cybersecurity, but if I can bring in the sort of defense angle to this and around cybersecurity, PSPC, or for those of you who don't know, Public Services and Procurement Canada, they're looking at right now cybersecurity certification models. And so the US has an approach called CMMC. And that's a good example of where Canada should be looking to align with the US on cybersecurity standards. There's no reason why we should try to strike it out on our own. And this is something, for example, that the Chamber's been strongly advocating for, and other industry associations like CADSI particularly, who've been really leading the charge on this. And so I think this is an example of where we should look to international standards and as opposed to a bespoke domestic approach. The last thing that I'll say is more about the business community action. GM, Sun Life, Scotiabank, all members of the chamber. I love the three of you guys, but as much as we have a broad-based multi-sector membership, not every company is active in the digital space, I can say. And so this is an example of where there's a lot of scope for the Canadian business community to step up, and governments are going to react to what stakeholders tell them. And so I think the private sector needs to also really amp up its voice to be able to try to exert more influence on how the government makes its decisions on the digital economy, because I think in the absence of a strong stakeholder community voice, we're going to see these disparate and dysfunctional elements continuing to pop up and emerge.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm sure that for any trade negotiators in the audience or any trade practitioners, I'm sure that they were quite happy to hear you talk about leveraging trade agreements to enforcing domestic regulations. So I hear that, and that's great that you mentioned that. But we talked a little bit earlier about you consume more online, you're engaging more online. This means there's more of your data out there. There's more of all this information kind of moving, across borders, moving even across provinces. And so I feel like a big piece of this puzzle is the privacy angle, right? And unlike other things, privacy is not necessarily something you can write into a trade agreement. So we start entering areas, like what you were mentioning, Sarah, what a trade agreement does and what it doesn't. So Victor, I know that you have some experience in this space. Can you walk us through, the privacy sort of framework? How does this framework, domestically, how is that impacting businesses engaging in international trade? And where do you think this is headed, and or where should it go from here?
Thanks. Yeah, sometimes where it's headed and what we're hoping for are not exactly aligned, but yeah, privacy. So I mean, with any conversation about e-commerce and data has to deal with privacy, right? Because and often we see privacy opposed to innovation, like it's a trade-off. Like you can't innovate with the data only up to a certain point. That you have to balance the privacy aspect. Like I don't see it like that. I think like for a company like ours, we don't sell goods, we don't make stuff and sell physical objects. We provide services, right? Financial services and other kinds of services related to that. So we're in the business of trust, right? People give us their sensitive data, financial data, healthcare data, actually based on their claims, and they expect us to protect it. We use that data to innovate because we look at the trends in that data across clients and provide them with new products that they might need or they might be wanting. And in order to innovate, we need to protect that data because they have to trust us. Like we lose that data in a massive privacy breach, we're dead, right? Like that, our whole reputation is based on that. So coupled with those standards that we have to keep for our own reputational reasons, we also, need rely on frameworks like governance frameworks, like in Canada. So Canada's privacy law, as Mark started talking about, known as PIPEDA, the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, a mouthful, is 20 years old. It served its purpose. It's principles based. We liked it. We think it was a high standard privacy framework. It still is. Problem is, it was developed 20 years ago, right? There weren't even smartphones around when this was developed, right? So the government has over the last couple of years worked on a new legislation to modernize the privacy framework based on the digital charter that Mark was mentioning earlier. And they tabled this legislation, I believe, in late 2020. Then we had an election, so it died on the order paper, unfortunately. And we're waiting and encouraging the government to table it again. And Minister Champagne said that it's a priority. So we're hoping that this can be tabled and passed because as we're seeing, as Mark said, we're seeing not only well, there's a provincial aspect, but there's also the EU, right? The European Union. So that's the trade aspect, right? We need to show that we're equivalent in our privacy protections to the EU, otherwise that could be disrupted, as the US has experienced. And so, but then also provinces, right? Like we have provinces that have had privacy frameworks, like Quebec, modernizing theirs, but then Ontario steps in and never had this kind of framework. So like this is a classic Canada problem, right? Like, multiple securities regulators, we're the only country that has that. Interprovincial trade barriers, like we go around promoting free trade, but we have barriers between our provinces. And now, like, let's please just not do it with data, right? Like, let's just have a consistent framework for data. Any people in Ottawa who work for the government know that they promote data, free data flows globally. We like that. We're supportive of Ottawa doing that. So let's get it done in our own backyard also, and not require companies to comply with 13 different privacy frameworks. And that's my hope for the future. Thank you.
Well, I just want to congratulate Victor for actually spelling out PIPEDA very successfully. I feel like that's in your record, so that's great. I'm glad you mentioned the whole Canada, the classic Canada problem, because the sort of like regulatory fragmentation. We have an internal trade agreement. Like that. This is clearly something that we need to work with. In terms of working with regulation across provinces, even to do business within Canada, let alone to do business outside Canada. And you yourself, Sarah, also mentioned earlier, businesses are not operating in a silo where, they're just going to do business within the confines of that trade agreement. They're thinking globally. So from a competitiveness angle, and I feel like we've been talking about this competitiveness piece for a very long time in the context of trade, right? What can we learn from this sort of more traditional approach to policy making, in the sense of, whether it is trade policy, or even, it sounds more like regulatory, alignment across provinces and international. What do you think we can do better, or what can we be doing differently when it comes to not repeating some of the mistakes that we've done in the past in the field of regulation in this space? And I know I'm giving you the hardest question, but do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a bit like a game of whack-a-mole, right? So, not only do we have the 14 jurisdictions in Canada, the federal and the provinces and the territories, but then you have the United States, and then you have 50 jurisdictions within the United States that are all regulating separately. So until we have a better North American concept on privacy, I think we're going to be facing a lot of challenges. And at the moment, there are not just inside Canada, but again, as we're all trading, especially within the North the context, but also globally, we are constantly engaging in various countries to ensure that privacy regimes are aligned and are not overly restrictive. And at the end of the day, when jurisdictions create these unique privacy frameworks that in some cases, I think it's a constituency play, right? We're going to have the best privacy framework. Hello, Massachusetts. In the end of the day, it harms the consumers. It harms the people who want the product, who need access to the product, who want to be mobile. There was a great piece, I think it was in Wired not too long ago, about a couple who wanted to buy a certain brand of car, happened to live in Massachusetts. They were really excited to get a couple of key safety options on the vehicle, which, because they bought the vehicle in Massachusetts and lived in Massachusetts, were turned off. Now, if they would have lived like literally 10 miles down the road in Rhode Island, they would have had access to these things. And so that's the fragmentization of the consumer environment based on the fragment of jurisdictional approaches on privacy is a really dangerous thing, I think. And so we really need to get behind the federal government coming forward with a federal privacy framework, because unless they do that, we're going to have all of the provinces filling the gap, right? Filling the vacuum, because I think it is a valuable concept that consumers want to have some clear understanding of what information they share, how they share it, where it's going, and how is it protected. And I don't think that's an unreasonable thing for consumers to ask. But when you have legislators who in most cases, are not subject matter experts, drafting legislation that is designed to take care of a specific constituency's need, you come up with, again, this patchwork of regulatory environments that makes it very hard for companies to operate, and even more importantly, harder for consumers to navigate. I think, there's somewhere north of 150 people on this call today. And, I would challenge the notion that all of us fully understand what's happening to our data in every jurisdiction that we do business. And so I think that that's something that kind of moving forward, governments need to do a better job of alignment on it. I think when you compare what's happened in digital trade to what's happened in manufactured trade, and look to what we've done manufacturing as kind of a guide, what we haven't done particularly well is we haven't created a framework that is really a notion of free trade. There is a very specific notion of managed trade within manufacturing and with agricultural commodities. And I think that as Canada has approached this at times, it's ended up shooting itself in the foot in order to create an environment where things have a stamp of Canadian regulatory alignment. In some ways, it's a competitive advantage, and especially as we move into kind of a new era of energy, that stamp of regulatory excellence is a competitive advantage. But in other ways, we have to be careful that we ensure that we're harmonizing and negotiating with others as we figure out our own domestic policies. It's not the worst thing in the world to cooperate with the United States when you're trying to come up with a continental digital privacy policy, for example.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. We have a couple of minutes left before wrapping up. And there's a question from the audience that I think we've kind of already in a sense, answered, but maybe not addressed directly. And I just wanted to put it out there, see if there's any of you who want to comment on it. And it's this dynamic between, can Canada truly be a rule maker or more of a rule follower when it comes to the rules that govern digital trade? Does anyone have a thought on that? Do you want to comment on that? I mean, I've worked in those policy tables and talking to I don't know, stakeholders from different countries. And like you said, Mark, it's a very complex process. It's messy. There's, political windows. There's different, things that get policymakers' attentions and government's attention. So, is this really about setting the rules or following the rules, or more about what we said, cooperation? I don't know if anybody has a thought in that space.
Yeah, so maybe I'll take a first go at it. Part of it is the lack of our ability to internally have a coherent approach to this, whether it's within the federal government or federally and provincially. One of the things too that I would just note is that governments, and this isn't meant to be like a comment to any one government, like it's applicable to any government at any country at any level, which is like the senior political leadership, especially over the last 2 years, has been in issues management mode, whether it's like the pandemic or supply chains or like Russia, Ukraine. And so like the ability for governments and the bandwidth to think about stuff that isn't in issues management is quite limited, I think. And so like data and privacy protection, it's kind of that classic, like, it's important, but it's not urgent, or at least it's perceived as important, but not urgent. It's probably the better way to phrase it. And so I think that has been a really limiting factor in like driving forward the action that we need to see. I'm not trying to say that like, I endorse that, position, but I think that it would be my sort of, pragmatic assessment of the situation.
Sure.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think that as much as Canada has, like people on this call know, a lot of good expertise and talent around trade negotiations and trade negotiators. Some of that's been hampered by the pandemic, as meetings have been taking place virtually. But what I think really at this stage, we are a taker in this field, not a rule maker. But I think it's urgent, therefore, to get involved proactively with some of these initiatives happening, like the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. The way that we can start to become more partaking in the rule-making process is to proactively join those groups. And I think that it's fair to say that it's been slow, right? The move towards joining something like the DEPA or other regional initiatives, whereas countries that in many ways are comparable to ours, New Zealand, Chile, Singapore sort of stands out as different, but they're sort of diving right into it, right? And I think that's an opportunity for a country, a smaller open economy like Canada, to have an influence on the world, right? And then this is an area that deserves more attention because it is really the future. I mean, we're already living it now. So I think that that's the first step before we can talk about rulemaking, is getting involved, being at the table, literally.
I want to just add to something that Mark said, because I think it's really important. When we jump as a government and as policymakers, and we jump from crisis to crisis and we ignore issues until they become urgent, we tend to make really bad policy decisions. And I think privacy is one of those areas. Trademark protections and copyright is another, where we often don't focus on it strategically. Using the subject matter expertise that exists within the different government departments until, a lawmaker comes up with a piece of legislation independently drafted to address certain issues. And that may well not actually solve the problem and may in fact create others. And so I think it's really important that we do take a strategic approach to things like digital privacy, trademark considerations, copyright planning, intellectual property, all of these things, although they might not feel urgent, unless we have a strategic vision and we create a policy environment that protects us strategically, we're gonna end up playing a game of legislative whack-a-mole that will rival the one that we're playing in the United States.
That's great. And I feel like I'm pushing it a little bit here, but I do have another question from the audience that I think this group is well placed to answer, and it is. They're asking specifically about one country. They're asking, can we learn lessons from this one country? But I think that actually can be expanded more broadly. Have you guys seen any good examples, or is there any lessons that we can learn from other countries in terms of what they are doing? And can we adopt some of those as a best practice here in terms of developing this rules framework?
I think the EU has served as a good guiding light on a number of different issues because they have thought strategically. So not just on digital privacy, but also within, for example, the battery raw materials supply chain. They have thought strategically well before any of the North American jurisdictions really started to come together with any strategic vision of what they wanted to do. So I think that there are examples, and they might not fit perfectly. It might be something that we have to adjust, but overall, at least one of the things that I think having kind of the separate governance of the EU provides for the European countries is this level of strategic, it's a space for strategic thinking that is not reactive, the way that the governments themselves necessarily sometimes end up being.
That's great. Well, we don't have any other questions for the moment. So I'm going to close it up on this note. I think that what I heard from the panelists today is obviously, you know, as in policy making, there's always this huge mountain of things that need to be addressed, but little by little, right? And like you tackle kind of the most urgent issues, but at the same time, you have to continue working towards, you know, that kind of distant, urgent issue that we can all kind of come to the table and discuss today. So thank you to all of you for all the work that you do in the space. I know that, you know, we talk frequently with Mark, we engage with government. So, you know, just let's keep that up. I think that government wants to hear from us. And thanks, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Sarah, for your time today, for sharing your thoughts. I think that this leaves us with a lot of things, you know, to reflect on. And I will hand it over to Colin, who I see has joined this call. Thanks again, Colin, for having us. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Adriana. Much for us to discuss there is, you know, I'm left with that sort of image of Sarah talking about the driver in Massachusetts who couldn't get access, but if they're in Rhode Island, they could. Mark's conversation about how we really don't have a table to get these things done federally provincially, and Victor's observation that we really are still a taker when it comes to digital trade, but we can be much more. And the observation that there are smaller countries like Chile, like Singapore, you've pointed out, that actually are out there leading. And it does strike me that this is one area where Canada has both interest and capacity, but the question becomes who will take the lead? I think it's clear from the discussion that we look to the federal government here to lead, but of course we can draw a lot from what's taking place at the province and territorial level as the kind of incubators of policy development. And as was pointed out, you know, Quebec and other jurisdictions, Ontario, are proceeding on this path. So still much for us to learn here. So again, my thanks to you, Adriana, for hosting this and setting us off in the content part of this, the content discussion part of this, and to, of course, Sarah, Mark, and Victor. So let me now invite Eileen Lucy, Laurie Troutman, and Alan Burson to join moderator Brian Kingston for a discussion on managing border logistics and supply chains. Again, another vital element in the management of Canada's relationship with the world. As Marie-France pointed out, we still, our biggest trading partner by a large measure is still the United States, and managing border logistics and supply chain is something that is still very much is top of the agenda. The Prime Minister knew was down in November's meeting with the President. The supply chain is there. I think there's to be a report in, I think, 120 days on how we manage supply chains. So let me turn this over now for the discussion of managing border logistics and supply chains to moderator Brian Kingston.
Great, thank you, Colin, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I love the State of Trade Conference. It's one of the best conferences going in terms of talking trade policy, and there's no shortage of issues to unpack here today. So I really appreciate the invitation, and good to see everybody. So before I hop into introductions, just a quick overview of what we're planning to cover here this morning. So supply chains has perhaps become one of the words of 2021. This used to be a term that was generally reserved for folks in the border logistics world. But now, it seems not a day passes where supply chains aren't discussed everywhere from a grocery store to a car dealer's lot or even in the House of Commons. So we've seen a number of unprecedented events, starting, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had an impact on border logistics and supply chains. And since then, it's been a series of events that have caused even more challenges and difficulties in terms of border management and supply chain management, everything from a global semiconductor shortage, which is impacting industries across the world. We've seen extreme weather events, border blockades in Canada quite recently, and now, of course, the conflict in Ukraine. So what we're hoping to explore here this morning is how do governments and businesses navigate this increasingly complex and challenging border and supply chain environment. It doesn't appear as though things are going to be getting any easier in the coming years. So we've got a great series of panelists this morning who are going to unpack this topic. So let me just start with brief introductions. So we have Eileen Lucy, the VP of Public Affairs at UPS Canada, Lori Troutman, the Director of Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University, and Alan Burson, currently the Executive Chairman of Altana AI and the former Commissioner of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency, as well as many, many other very senior roles in the U.S. government, including at Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. So I couldn't think of a better group to discuss this issue with us today. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump right into questions and we'll have a free-flowing conversation. So Eileen, I'm going to start with you. You've got a very interesting perspective on this, given your role at UPS. And I just want to understand, how does UPS ensure supply chain continuity? I outlined some of the issues that we've witnessed over the past couple of years. How have you managed things like extreme weather and the flooding in BC? And we'll start with that, and then I got a few more questions, but curious to know how you handle it from a UPS perspective.
Well, thank you, Brian, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me today. I've just been fascinated by the conversation so far and really looking forward to this one as well. In terms of ensuring supply chain continuity, well, I would say that has essentially become my job description over the last 2 years. And the same would go for all members of the public affairs team at UPS worldwide. To offer just a bit of context, UPS, of course, operates in Canada, delivering to every address from coast to coast to coast. But we also operate in 220 countries and territories worldwide. And that's a network that we've had to keep running throughout the last 2 years. Brian, you mentioned a couple of those challenges. I think I have a few more to add to the list. So we have, of course, had the global pandemic, extreme weather events, certainly that we saw in BC last year, the most recent border disruptions through the protests that took place at multiple border crossings. But we also had some labor disruptions taking place in the context of collective bargaining at the CBSA and even at the Port of Montreal too. And now, of course, we're all watching the situation unfold in Ukraine. So all of those events are having impacts on the global supply chain. And when it comes to an organization like UPS, which is operating, we're multimodal. I intentionally picked the background behind me today because I think that we're probably most well known for the brown package cars that do that final mile delivery and get the package to your door. But we are also a global airline. We operate by ocean as well. So every single mode of transportation is something that is moving within our network. And throughout the last couple of years, I think some of the big shifts and trends that we've seen, well, the first, and this has been mentioned earlier today, is of course that the changing patterns in consumer demand. So an unprecedented shift in consumer demand, as well as swings in consumer preferences. So I know that everybody's well aware of that shift to e-commerce and individuals buying a lot more online as they've been subject to restrictions. But from the UPS vantage point, we also see some of the changes in the types of commodities that are moving across the border. The more obvious ones might be PPE, COVID tests, and of course, COVID vaccines as well, which have been moving in our network. We've delivered over 1 billion of them around the world so far. But also things like bread makers. Remember that time, the time of making bread, exercise bikes, of course, and even hair dye, as people were resorting to do-it-yourself mechanisms at home during lockdowns. So that's something that we've had to manage. I'd say the second trend that we've seen is certainly just generally global disruption in global aviation and shipping, which is also quite well known. I'd say port closures that were related to COVID, as well as shipping container shortages, have certainly created a lot of pressure points in global shipping, having a knock-on impact on supply chains worldwide. And then air capacity. So global air capacity, air cargo capacity was down primarily due to the loss of that belly hold space, as we refer to it, in passenger aircraft. When they were not running, we also lost some of that additional space. We did, of course, still have cargo aircraft running, but that didn't come without challenges either. There were different protocols emerging in countries around the world that were impacting the ability of our pilots and crew to be able to continue to move between countries without being subject to mandatory isolation or other types of restrictions. And then the third challenge is, of course, pandemic-induced labor shortages, which we see worldwide, and which are a challenge not only for our industry, but for many others too. In terms of how we handle it, well, certainly on the government relations side, our focus shifted completely to maintaining operational continuity and engaging with government officials at the federal, provincial, municipal levels, regional public health authorities as well, to ensure that every aspect of our operations, not just the final mile delivery, not just the airline, not just the warehouses, but the entire network altogether, because that's what you need to keep running, could continue to do so. We focus on our employee safety within our buildings, but also if you think about extreme weather events or some of the recent disruption at the border, making decisions on a daily basis as to whether or not we're going to send our employees to certain locations and whether we will continue to operate our network or make adjustments in the shorter term. Globally, we've been advocating for a common set of rules in terms of essential service definitions, as well as the movement of cargo pilots across the world to enable that essential movement of those aircraft. And then in Canada, a lot of our work with provinces as they developed some of their essential service lists, as well as on the public safety side. We've worked closely with CBSA on vaccine movement protocols. So, ensuring that there is dedicated customs protocol to enable those most essential of deliveries, those COVID-19 vaccines, to move unimpeded across Canada's borders and be delivered to where they're needed most, as well as different CBSA protocol for some of the other disruptions that we've seen, which we might get into a bit later in our conversation. And then on construction, think about the capacity increases that our industry has needed. We've needed to construct new buildings, and we've been doing so in Canada. The pandemic did cause some disruption to construction. So that was another area that we found ourselves having to focus on. How do we ensure that we can keep that construction moving so that we can flex our network and have that additional capacity at the time that we've needed it? So that's just a kind of whirlwind tour of the last 2 years of what we've been seeing and how we've been responding to it.
Excellent, thank you. And I want to come back to you on a couple of those examples, but first I'm going to bring Lori into the conversation. You mentioned something really interesting related to the movement of people. And, I think one of the things, one of the positives, if you will, throughout the pandemic, we did see goods trade largely moving relatively unimpeded across the Canada-US border, despite all of the challenges. However, where we have seen major challenges and continue to are on the movement of people, company personnel, even people taking holidays. And so my question for you, Lori, and this is going to get into a bit kind of broader border policy. How do we return to a pre-COVID border where you have both goods moving, but importantly, people moving efficiently, quickly, safely across the border? Because we're clearly not there yet, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. And I think we've seen a real lack of a binational border management policy through this whole, particularly through the border blockades. So how do we address that? So there's a couple questions there for you.
Thanks, Brian, and good morning, everyone. And as you laid out, the border restrictions did a pretty good job of sort of delineating between the movement of goods and the movement of people. We had that essential category and the non-essential category. But the challenge is, movement of goods is really done by people, not just by trucks. And so to a certain degree, a lot of trade does depend on people and how well they can move. And what we saw was just a lot of gray area around what sort of work was essential. So something I heard quite often was a business executive who might be trying to cross the border to do a site visit to sign a contract or look at some property. And because that site visit wasn't sort of part of the daily routine of that person's workload, it wasn't considered essential. The other challenge around that is that determination wasn't made until that person was actually at the border, in the process of trying to do a business negotiation or some other type of work activity. And so that's incredibly disruptive. And I think a lot of issues or a lot of businesses face those issues around manufacturing sites and signing contracts and really being able to maintain the trade that's been in the works from contracts and negotiations that might have happened years in the past. So I think the challenge now of sort of getting back to where we were before is that there's this kind of cloud of continued uncertainty. These border restrictions, they were very popular in Canada for the most part, and they were also pretty popular in the United States, and they were popular both for the Trump administration and the Biden administration as a tool to control who was able to cross the border and sort of the size of those flows as well. And I think that that's probably a policy tool we're going to encounter again, because we all know we're going to encounter some sort of global health crisis or other type of global crisis again. So that added uncertainty is really a challenge and an impediment for cross-border trade relations, but also for local communities and businesses and economies that over the past, post 9/11 years in particular, have really built up entire industries around a functioning border, because I don't think there was really a recognition that border might not function, and particularly for as long as it did. I mean, really, we're talking about over a year of people who had typically been able to cross not being able to cross, and depending on how you parse it, almost 2 years. So, that question of whether or not, or how do we get back to the sort of pre-COVID years, I think the answer is we don't. I don't think we're going to get back to that type of border, and that's kind of what we faced after the 9/11 years. We've never gotten back to that time when you didn't need a passport to cross the Canada-US border, and it's hard for many of us to even imagine now that it used to be that way. But these external shocks have long-term policy implications. And so I think where we're at on the border, there's good and there's bad. I think to a certain extent, the border restrictions forced particularly Public Safety Canada and CBSA to really innovate and to come up with new ways to collect the information that they've needed. And so, for example, CBSA now has the ArriveCAN app, which has allowed them to collect information about travelers before they reach the border, so that when you reach the border, you're not at the first stage of providing all your information, you're sort of at the last stage. And that's been something that's been really desirable for CBSA to be able to do. They've really kind of leapfrogged in their technology. And I think in a broader context that we're in, there is a heightened attention on making the border work better in both directions. And that can be a really good thing. That can provide funding and, again, really spur innovation on the border that could maybe be somewhat stagnant in off years. Now, the challenge, as you highlighted, is the US and Canada have not been doing this collaboratively. We did really well at the beginning of the border restrictions, incredibly swift and efficient in deciding what we wanted to do and executing it in a tandem fashion. But that was really sort of the extent of our collaboration. And coming out of these restrictions, we see that Canada and the US are in very different positions on what sort of information they're requiring. And that has real implications for cross-border travel, and it really affects the time it takes to cross the border, the cost it takes to cross the border, and I think has created a lot of friction. And the confusing thing for the average traveler, including people that are engaged in cross-border work travel, is that it's really hard to figure out what exactly you need to do to cross the border. And the more, again, uncertainty there is there, the harder it's going to be for people to cross. So, we've seen those systems diverge. The extent to which we're able to potentially align them or make things interoperable, I think, is really the question as to if we can get back to at least a pre-COVID sense of cross-border mobility, even though that mobility will look different.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I want to get into a little bit the binational border policy discussion and how I think you make a great point that there isn't necessarily a return to sort of pre-COVID normal. We've had a fundamental change here, but how can we manage the relationship more effectively with the United States going forward? So I definitely want to dig into that, but I want to bring Alan in because you've got a lot of experience on the front lines at the most senior levels in the US government managing the border. And so I wanted to get your perspective on lessons that we have learned over the past couple of years or previously, post 9/11, other border disruptions that have occurred that could be applied to what hopefully will be a renewed binational border management policy between Canada and the US. So over to you, Alan.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Brian. I want to start off by agreeing with Eileen that we really are in the midst of a perfect storm. Everything from labor shortages to climate change and everything she described in between. And I agree with Lori that Humpty Dumpty can't be put back together again. That the notion that we can recreate where we were is an illusion that we should dispense with readily. That doesn't mean that we don't stand at a landmark moment. We are at a 9/11 moment, and we have to take into account that this has been more catastrophic than 9/11. After, when we compare, for example, across North America, but specifically in the United States, there have been more than 1 million deaths. That's 300 times more than the fatalities on 9/11. And then with regard to the interaction between our countries, Canada and the United States, we saw in the aftermath of 9/11 a reopening of the border within days, as opposed to a shutdown that lasted almost 20 months with regard to so-called non-essential traffic. So we are at a crossroads. And I think, though, as the Chinese like to remind us, a crisis presents an opportunity as much as a significant danger. And we are at a 9/11 moment. And the challenge will be, first, that we actually incorporate public health fully into the border security management regime. That border management now has to recognize that, in fact, contagious disease is among the greatest threats. We've been operating for almost 20 years now on the theory that counterterrorism is the lens through which we should look at cross-border mobility. That's no longer the case, although we shouldn't put terrorism to the side because non-state risks, including terrorists and other transnational criminals, actually, as we know, constitute a major threat. So what do we do? As Lenin famously said, what's to be done? It seems to me that first we have to recognize that the tools that we developed after 9/11, risk management, advanced information, targeting, trusted traveler and trader programs, they retain their value and they are and must remain a pillar in our border management regimes. But they're going to require a reorientation and an adaptation that so far, as Lori pointed out, we have not shown the bilateral or let alone binational capacity to tackle. So let's take passenger mobility. We operated in the counterterrorist context actually quite successfully, knocking on wood, in the sense that advance information and then vetting passengers against watch lists, including them on white lists, banning them on no-fly lists and the like actually did succeed. But the theory of action has to shift to recognize that in the contagious disease context, we're not looking for needles in a haystack anymore. In fact, we actually have to vet the entire haystack in the public health context. And frankly, we don't have and haven't developed the capacity to do that. We have to, in effect, triage, be prepared to triage passengers and develop the tools and put the tools in the operator's toolbox that are necessary to do that. Everything from vaccination certificates to health passports to mass immediate screening capacity and testing capacity. Contact tracing and all of the other techniques have to be actually refined and placed into the border operator's toolbox and his or her a repertoire of inspection. We haven't moved very much forward on that. But I want to go back to a point you made, Brian, that underlies this, that it's not really just passengers anymore. We take satisfaction from the fact that trade continued after March of 2020. But in fact, the new set of challenges that Eileen referenced really affect cargo primarily. And I will go venture to say that, in fact, we're going to see a slowdown and problems with regard to the movement of goods that will rival those that we've experienced with people. And what is that attributable to? It's really the reemergence of traditional great power rivalries in the global geopolitical context. So whether we're talking about identifying goods that are subject to tariffs on trade with China, or in fact now identifying the Russian oligarchs and the Russian companies that are subject to sanctions because they've been placed on massive sanction lists across North America and the world, this is going to challenge the traditional paradigm that we've had with regard to the movement of goods. We focused in both of our countries on the importer of record, and we have insisted for security, counter-terror security purposes, that importers know their suppliers. They have to identify who is actually sending them the goods that they're bringing across the borderline. That's no longer the case in this new geopolitically complicated world, highlighted, of course, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where in fact importers of record are going to have to know not just their suppliers, but their suppliers. And there's going to have to be a revision of the opacity of the global supply chain so that not only first-tier suppliers, but second-tier, third-tier suppliers actually are brought into visibility. And it's fair to say that we are at the very threshold of developing the tools in the private sector, let alone in the public sector, to be able to deal with that. So let me just respond directly to your question about what are the lessons that we've learned. First of all, I'd say that we have to recognize that borders in North America deserve special attention rather than treatment as just another part of the international travel zone or the global supply chain. The closure of the so-called non-essential crossers has been devastating, as Lori pointed out, to border communities, their families, and local economies. When we shut down cross-border travel for health reasons or for any other reason, authorities need to start the process immediately of developing criteria and requirements for opening it up. Make a plan, even a bad plan, that can be improved as we go along. We can't do what we did, which is to lump family members, tourists, business people, irregular migrants, and terrorists into one undifferentiated bundle and leave them to stew month after month. Don't let the best be the enemy of the good. We should have opened up borders months ago for vaccinated travelers, and we might have started with Nexus members, for example. We might have created an ESTA system that would have permitted this border closure to end a lot sooner than it has, and it still hasn't ended, frankly, in many practical senses. The second lesson that I draw from our experience is that the radio silence from government to the public and the private sector regarding border management has been deafening. It's really been a disgrace binationally, and we need to recognize that if we're to move forward. The best solutions inevitably will be co-created with the private sector, and the trust and confidence of the community is essential. This requires better gathering of information, analysis, and dissemination of public health data, and a commitment to the issuance of regular and clear guidance. Again, the radio silence was deafening. Good faith, not perfection, and reasonable risk rather than zero tolerance should be the standards that govern cross-border mobility. Third, the necessary outreach and planning has to be coordinated between CBSA and CBP. It has to be done on a North American basis across the US, Canada, and Mexico. And it has to include local, state, provincial, and federal levels, not one or any of them, and certainly not all of them acting independently. For example, after our experience with the SARS and the H1N1 avian flu, North American public health plans were drawn up in 2007, 2012, only to be ignored when push came to shove with COVID. We've learned that viruses are borderless and they must be confronted regionally. If we continue to act unilaterally in the way that Lori's, I think, accurately described, especially in the context of contagious disease, but also in terms of the reemergence of geopolitical rivalries, we're going to be clapping with one hand. We have to build a cooperative border management. It won't look like what it looked like after 9/11. But remember, again, after 9/11, the Smart Border Accords were actually implemented and the border was opened up relatively quickly. That contrasts with where we are. So I'm not a great one for focusing on failure, although we have to really understand what went wrong in this context. In many ways, the review process should involve a bilateral, perhaps a trilateral 9/11 Commission report. As I said, 9/11, as terrible as it was, pales in comparison to the catastrophe this has visited on people, the society, and the economy. We have to continue to look these lessons and look them in the eye and recognize that it's been a disaster and that we can't permit it to happen again. You know, A.J.B. Taylor, the British historian, recognized that when you reach a turning point, if you don't turn, you're left behind. That's not really what the future of North America is about. And I think this is a great opportunity to actually seize the moment, but it's going to require different institutional arrangements. We can't have border blockades without having US and Canadian authorities in close cooperation. And this can't be just on a crisis basis. We have to institutionalize and create ongoing working committees that are actually planning for the new future that we are thrust into. So I'm actually hopeful when you look at what Canada and the United States have done together, whether it's in the context of security or in the context of trade facilitation. We have a good track record, but the challenges we face now really are going to put this cooperation really a test, and I trust we're up to it.
Thank you, Alan. That's a great list of lessons learned and actions that we should be taking going forward. So I have a follow-up question, and anyone can jump in on this. But you mentioned, the ongoing great power rivalry that we're witnessing, and effectively the return to regionalization in the world. Does that create an opportunity to kind of revitalize the North American trade zone? We have the new agreement, the USMCA, CUSMA. It seems to me like there'd be an opportunity for Canada and Mexico to be engaging the US and really focusing on the North American context in terms of border management in particular. How do we do that? And is there an appetite for that in Washington to have that discussion, or is it very much an America-focused discussion? Because it seems to me that there's an opportunity.
So let me take a quick crack at that. I think you're right. The American century is clearly coming to an end. But the question is whether or not the North American century is just beginning, given all of the competitive advantages that we have in this region, from 500 million people to 17% of world trade. The staggering advantages of water, energy resources, and the like. Can we actually bring these to bear in the new multipolar geopolitical situation that's arising? The answer is yes, but you raise a good question. So after Donald Trump came into office, declaring NAFTA the worst trade deal that had ever been reached, with the help of Robert Lighthizer, he actually negotiated a reasonably good follow-up to NAFTA, but it wasn't nearly enough. So I take your point, and I hope that policymakers in Ottawa and in Mexico City and in the United States understand that we can improve on the USMCA. This trade deal that doesn't mention North America, and this trade deal that each country has given its own name to. We can do better than that. And in fact, I think the convening by the Biden administration of the North American Leadership Summit in its early days is a good sign, but look what's happened even there. There is no institutional capacity to follow up on it. We don't have the kind of attention in the Privy Council or in Los Pinos or in the National Security Council in the United States that will actually build this agenda. So the short answer is yes, that's where we should be going, but it's going to require a lot of leadership that is focused on many other challenges today, Brian.
Thank you. Eileen, I want to follow up on something that Alan raised and get your perspective. And this is the transparency in supply chains. I think it's a really important point. And you're seeing this across industries now, trying to ensure that there's more transparency into the supply chain at every tier, and effectively have almost an early warning system so that there's more ability to identify potential shortages or challenges at an earlier date and then put in place plans to avoid any impacts. How does UPS manage supply chain transparency? And is this something that you're seeing a lot of work going into and ask from your clients in terms of how the supply chain is viewed and how much visibility you have into it?
Well, it's a great question. Yes, I think something that we've been seeing over recent months and recent years is more nearshoring being conducted by our customers as they not necessarily aim to kind of reshore entirely, but they do try where possible to make their supply chain slightly shorter, to make that a bit more manageable. We're also seeing a lot more focus from our customer base on warehousing, moving from what we call a just-in-time model to a just-in-case model, with a bit more active and engaged thinking about warehousing and what needs to be kept closer to hand in case of unexpected situations. To Alan's point on supply chain transparency, it's a very interesting one, and maybe I can kind of gather. I was jotting down a few thoughts as both Laurie and Alan were speaking, and I can maybe share it in this way. On the previous panel, Sarah Goldfeder mentioned creating a space for strategic thinking, which I really liked. I think that captures exactly what we need from a North American supply chain perspective, given everything that we have all witnessed and the challenges that lie ahead. Alan, thank you for mentioning sustainability. That's an important one that we must not forget in this context too. I think that we won't be short of agenda items to discuss if we're able to create that strategic space. Supply chain transparency is one, thinking about how to leverage new technologies. The one that comes to mind, Alan is probably far more expert on this than I am, but certainly blockchain and the potential applications of technologies like blockchain to enable greater and more dynamic supply chain visibility and transparency. Laurie, you mentioned for the movement of people, you talked about ArriveCan, and that got me thinking about, on the movement of goods side, you mentioned that the benefit of ArriveCan is that you kind of reach that final stage of giving information over to the border authorities before you land in Canada. On the good side, we're also seeing that kind of thinking when you think about pre-clearance and pre-screening that CBSA are actively engaged in and that UPS has been a long time supporter of. Those are all initiatives that will require, whether it's US, Canada, or North American, perhaps even broader collaboration. And I think it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't carve out some space for a debrief between, public policy leaders and the key stakeholders who have had a lot of boots on the ground experience over the last couple of years with what hasn't gone so well, and the challenges that we've all faced with the moving target nature of those operational continuity challenges that I spoke to before. So a somewhat convoluted answer there, but those were all of the things that I was jotting down as I listened to our previous speakers.
Great, thank you, Eileen. And yeah, Lori, I'm gonna turn to you. A couple of things. First, I just appreciate your reaction to what you've heard from Alan and Eileen with respect to some of the lessons learned, but also what we can do to engage and a North American approach to border management going forward. I also wanted to just get a little bit more of your perspective on the technology side of things. I think it's really interesting that you raised the ArriveCan app as an example of something that, a technology solution that moved at, absolutely record speed for a government context to come up with a solution like that, implement it and have it in force. Do you think going forward, that's going to basically create the tone for these new types of innovations and new types of border screening processes that we can apply and make sure that we're addressing all of the health and security concerns, but doing it in a way that makes the movement at the border efficient? Or was this just a one-off? It was a response to a crisis and it's kind of back to regularly scheduled programming. So over to you.
Well, thanks, Brian. And I absolutely agree 100% with everything that Eileen and Alan have said. And maybe I don't know if I can add to it, but I could distill it. And I think, there's a couple key ingredients in this sort of need for a bilateral framework and better coordination going forward. One is, as Alan highlighted, it shouldn't be sort of a one-off in response to what's happening in the moment. It needs to be ongoing. It needs to be institutionalized. And as Eileen pointed out, we need to include stakeholders across the board. And I guess what I sort of add to the conversation is the people on the ground and the communities who live with the border every day are really key stakeholders that often get overlooked. And that's not just businesses or community members, it's also the practitioners and the line officers themselves who see what's working and not working. And I can say that we've had a number of those instances where I work in BC Washington region where the line officer will say, well, yeah, it doesn't make sense that when you fill out your ArriveCan, you can't include going back home as your quarantine plan if you're driving into Canada from 10 kilometers across the border. So working out some of those kinks and improving those policies should really include multi-scaled sort of connections between what I think of as the top levels of government who are making the decisions and also the people who are really navigating the realities of those policies and face those unintended consequences, and I think can probably sort of anticipate them and really improve policy as well. And so your second question is to me a fascinating one, because it's what I look at all the time is ArriveCan, are these sort of new policy shifts here to stay? And I think I sort of mentioned this briefly, but ArriveCan was an incredible solution for the land border, because if you think about it, when you're flying in the air mode, governments and airlines know pretty much everything about you before you get on the plane. They know your name, they know your passport number, they know all that information. So they can do a lot of that pre-vetting, and it's been an incredible tool for both Canada and the US. But the land border has always been a struggle because that pre-arrival information didn't exist. You have millions and millions of people showing up to the border. You have no idea who they're going to be or what their intentions might be. And so I think ArriveCan is absolutely here to stay. I think certainly it needs to be refined and it needs to be connected to better education and outreach than it is. Right now you have a lot of travelers who show up at the border who have no idea what ArriveCan is. They've never heard of it. Maybe they don't have smartphones. We have a long way to go before that system is, I think, a good one and a functional one and an efficient one, but I do think it's here to stay. And the question is the US going to reciprocate that sort of policy approach. They haven't so far. Any of you who have driven over the border from Canada in the last few months know that you just show up and you sort of say, yeah, I'm vaccinated, and maybe somebody asks you for your record, and maybe they don't. So it's a totally different approach than the Canadian one. And the important point of that is, if the US does decide to develop one, or if Canada does decide to sort of modify ArriveCAN to improve it and make it much more functional when people really start moving across the border again, are we going to do that in a similar way? Or are we going to have two totally different systems where travelers are entering all that information in two different places, two different times? And that's really going to have a huge impact on the fluidity and the connectedness between our countries.
Great, thank you. Alan, did you want to add in on that? I saw you had your hand up there.
Yeah. I just in listening to Lori, I agree that this kind of information technology and traffic segmentation at the land border, which would mirror what we do in the maritime and aviation context, is due. But here's where I differ a little bit, Lori. This isn't going to be done by government. I think we're in the midst of such a massive transformation and given the challenges that Eileen pointed out so well, this has got to be co-created with the private sector. This has got to be a series of things that mirror what happened, and UPS was at the forefront of this after the Yemen cargo plot in 2011, 2010. The air cargo express carriers created the air cargo advanced screening. This basically was a system not imposed by the government on the private sector, but rather one that was developed in tandem with the private sector. We now need to shift that, and all of this innovation has got to be generated by the private sector, but then you have the problem of receptivity by the public sector, and that's something we need to work with our political leaders on. And then the second point, though, is this is the opportunity inherent in the current moment. We need to be moving toward a pre-clearance regime, not just in the way that we've done it in the past, but one that would actually recognize that most shipments of goods, as most crossings of people, are repetitive. These are not things that happen. The exception is not the rule. The rule is that most people who cross the border cross it all the time. The same lesson on cargo. Cargo is repetitive, and what we have to do is start to enlist time and space more effectively, so that we're segmenting the traffic, but also we're pre-clearing people and goods in the manner of ArriveCAN, but also in the context of cargo, from the time it leaves the factory floor to the time it gets onto the importer's shipping dock. We need to have this pre-cleared so that border agents and their agencies can focus on the exception, not the rule. And that's the way we actually start moving toward a regime in which the haystack is vetted, and we create the trusted networks, not only between regulators, but also between regulators and the private sector, that permits a much more seamless cross-border mobility for both people and goods.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems to me like now would be the time for reinvigorating the Beyond the Border initiative, an institutionalized Canada-US initiative to address some of these issues, work on technology solutions, and achieve some of these outcomes. Now, we've only got 5 minutes left, so I do want to just bring in a question related to the Ukraine. I mentioned it at the start, but I just wanted to get your perspectives on what are the implications of the conflict. Now we've seen unprecedented sanctions rolled out, no-fly zones being put in place. What does this mean for global supply chains and border management? And there was one audience question directed at you, Eileen, specifically from a UPS perspective. What do no-fly zones do to your shipping capabilities from an air freight perspective? So a broad question, but would appreciate the views from all of the panelists on how you see this playing out and what it will ultimately mean for global trade. Eileen, you want to start, and then
Sure, I can begin. So, well, first and foremost, for the situation in Ukraine, UPS has operations and employees in Ukraine. So the first thing that we've been doing is making daily contact with those individuals to make sure that they're accounted for and to provide support to those individuals and their families where we can. From an operational perspective, we have suspended service into, out of, and within both Ukraine and Russia, as well as into and out of Belarus at this time. So clearly some very direct and immediate operational consequences for the movement of goods in that region. That will be a dynamic situation and something that our organization is evaluating on a daily basis. Third is that the humanitarian assistance arm of UPS, the UPS Foundation, has mobilized to provide on-the-ground support in the surrounding region as we see an influx of people who require support in Europe and likely elsewhere too. So I suppose that's what we're doing in the short term. In the longer term, I took a note in the very first presentation by Marie-France Paquette. She mentioned energy prices and overall inflation, and certainly in the medium and longer term, when we think about our own network planning, those kinds of broader economic and energy dynamics are certainly likely to impact trade flows, and so that's something that we will also be keeping a careful eye on as an organization.
Okay, great, thank you. Lori, over to you.
I'll just say briefly, that certainly the continued uncertainty is a challenge. And I think for the Canada-US relationship, I hope we continue to be aligned on our response and our thinking, and perhaps that unites us and particularly our leaders. And from a trade perspective, Canada and the US, I think the US biggest import from Canada is mineral fuels, so unrefined oil and gas. And so that could certainly impact border and trade flows to the extent to which what Canada and the US decide to do in terms of mineral oil imports could be something to watch.
Yeah, just briefly, Brian, if the reaction of a unified North America and EU doesn't lead to the removal of Putin by powers within the Kremlin, this is going to be an issue a lot more serious than supply chains. Obviously if it persists, Russia could well, notwithstanding its scale, be converted into a North Korea pariah in the global supply chain system, which will have a massive economic and impact on the Russian people, obviously, but also on the world economy. But I'm just tempted to end that this is a lot more important than global supply chains. This is a defining moment. It's a Cuban Missile Crisis in my mind that will define the international order over the next 20 years. So we've got to get this right, and he's got to be stopped.
Well said. Yep, I think supply chains may be are one of our more minor concerns in the context of this conflict if it spirals out of control. Well, thank you. Excellent conversation. We covered a lot there in 45 minutes, a lot to unpack, but clearly this is a topic that's not going away. And I am left optimistic, at least from a North American perspective, that there is an opportunity here for Canada, Mexico, the US to engage on border policy. And we've seen now that we can put together effective apps like ArriveCan and other technology solutions in a crisis, and hopefully going forward we'll see the introduction, and to your point, Alan, working with the private sector to ultimately make borders more efficient going forward. So with that, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our speakers. Really excellent discussion here this morning. And Colin, I'm going to throw it back to you.
Brian, thank you. I just kept being riveted and listening to the whole presentations. Eileen, the way you described delivery of and what you've had to go through at UPS was really remarkable. And I just was sort of struck because, of course, every garbage day now, the boxes that are all beside garbages that we didn't used to see before the pandemic, that's now a permanent point because of the increased reliance on, it takes us to digital trade, but it's also delivery. And so you painted a picture which I will not forget, and appreciate how important what you do is. And as you said, it's not just in time anymore, it's just in case. Laurie, as always, you are the ultimate realist about the challenges at the border, and your observation that we should be doing this binationally at a minimum. We had the capacity, and I think back to 9/11 when we got the Smart Border Accord, and John Manley, who we'll hear from later, and Governor, later Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge. It just seems that we had that capacity. And Alan, as the architect of finding a needle in the haystack, you must ruefully think a lot of the lessons that you learned and a lot of the lessons that you applied, and that both Canada and the US benefited from your whole approach to kind of needle in the haystack and how we could screen things. And as you correctly point out, we've always had a customs screen. After 9/11, we added a security screen, and as you and Laurie point out, there is now going to be a health screen, because that's broader than simply terrorism. And as you say, we're into a new paradigm, and how we deal with it is really the challenge for us. But I can't help thinking that if Canada and the United States can't get this right, then who can? Because no two countries have had the experience. We've got some innovations out there. I do think ArriveCAN is a user of ArriveCAN. I think it works, and I'm kind of troubled that we aren't able to do this together. So tremendous amount out there for us to think about, exactly what I hoped you would do, Brian, with the panel. So thank you again to Eileen, Alan, and Laurie. And now let me invite Meredith Lilly, John Weeks, and John Boskerell to join moderator Sharon Singh to take the stage for a discussion on values in trade, incorporating ESG, forced labor, and climate. Sharon, over to you.
Thank you, Colin. And if anybody can't hear me, especially the panelists, just speak up. I'm joining you from Vancouver, the traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I acknowledge that many of you will be listening in from the traditional territories of other Indigenous nations. Thank you to our panelists. All three of you should be at least no stranger to any of you that are listening in. Let me just quickly do a round of introductions, and I mean that very quickly, and I won't do them justice. Meredith Lilly is a seasoned and recognized expert on international trade policy. She can be seen on TV or lecturing at Carleton University. John Boskerell, my esteemed colleague from McCarthy Tetrao, and who I have the privilege of calling one of my advisors when I was in my former life, is one of the gurus in international trade. And I can tell you his ability to tweet, LinkedIn, breaking news of relevance is so impressive, and I'm sure he has an influencer badge on Instagram. And there is John Weeks, another esteemed colleague who I used to boast to clients was simply a phone call away. Chief negotiator of NAFTA, WTO ambassador, various high-ranking positions in government, and an all-around expert in international trade policy and trade agreement. So with that, as Colin has described our topic, values in trade, incorporating ESG, addressing forced labor, not putting forced labor into values in trade, and climate change. Now, I've been practicing in the areas under the umbrella of ESG since I graduated from law school, but I am not a trade lawyer, so I come this at a very different angle. And I know that some of you are thinking, well, another panel on ESG. And if you're an ESG skeptic or a purist that believes that ESG linked matters or social goals, that the inclusion of which may be unnecessary for an economic agreement, I respect that view. But let me attempt to shape why I think this is an important link and why this link is not new. Promoting human rights, be it labor rights, for example, through trade policy is not new. Our panelists can explain how the precursors to the USMCA contain, for example, provisions related to labor practices. And in my view, nor are protections on environment a new inclusion in trade policy. There were environmental protections included in the GATT as an exception to the general provisions. So I don't think this is, as you can tell, a new topic. And even the recent focus in Canada on gender equity, how apt since it's International Women's Day today, so congratulations, combating forced labor in the supplies chain and addressing transparency. We have another bill before the Senate on that. or a potential border carbon adjustment to prevent carbon leakage and address competitiveness. All these linked are matters linked to ESG, or increasingly being linked to ESG. So, almost anything that you can throw in can be linked to ESG. And even more recently, we're seeing, and I hope this panel will get into it, the existing tools that the Canadian government has in its toolbox, and those that corporate Canada and the corporate world generally have utilized against as sanctions or other means to punish or deter or otherwise send a message to Russia. And I don't want to conflate that with the overarching trend in ESG, because I think the Russian situation is critical, as you heard the other panelists speak about. But I think whether you're of the belief that ESG should be used only to screen investment, or whether it's to shield ethical investment and opportunities, all of these two distinctions being conflated right now. And in some instances, we're seeing the baby thrown out with the bathwater. I think there is an appetite, and there is an appetite to include ESG in trade policy. And there always has been an appetite to include trade policy, because the distinction, whether it's ethical investment or whether it's a screening tool, I think politically unnecessary, because you answer to the public opinion. So with that, let me get into the experts who really came here to speak from, and I hope that framing and my working thesis can be supported as we draw out some of the comments. Let me start with you, John Weeks. You've been doing trade negotiations since the 70s, drawing on from years of that trade negotiation. I'd be interested in see how has ESG and human rights and related issues being steadily incorporated in trade policy? I'd be interested in a bit of a narrative from you and how you've seen it creep in.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon. And you're certainly right. This has been something that's been present for a very long time. And I think when I started thinking about exactly what I'd say, I thought, well, let me go back and take a look at a brief look at the Havana Charter, which was the effort to develop a rules-based trading system at the end of the Second World War, and created the sort of third leg of the stool, of which the other two were the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And in the Havana Charter, it's quite interesting. It was Article 1. It's very brief. Realizing the aims set forth in the Charter of the United Nations of Economic and Social Progress and Development, envisaged in Article 55 of that charter, particularly the attainment of higher living standards, full employment, and conditions. It's quite interesting, I think, to see that these ideas were present at the very beginning of the post-World War trading system. And indeed, if you take another look at the Havana Charter, the whole first full chapter of that agreement was about employment and economic activity. So now, of course, this agreement was never ratified by the United States. In fact, the president decided not to send it to Congress because he knew it wouldn't pass. And so the first setback to moving down that road was right there. Salvaged out of the wreckage was the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And in the preamble to the GATT, it picks up on some of these things, and it talks about the importance of conducting trade with a view to raising living standards, ensuring full employment, and a large and steadily growing volume of real income. So you can see that the idea was present there at the beginning of the GATT. And then, of course, as you've already alluded to, the general exceptions provisions of the GATT in Article 20 allowed members to take actions which would otherwise be inconsistent with the provisions of the GATT if they were relating to products of prison labor. So the idea was nobody had to accept imports of those goods, and also relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. So you see some of the beginning of both labor and trade and environment issues at that early stage. I do recall a number of times in the 1970s and later on during the 80s, but before we got into more heightened provisions dealing with these matters. There were a number of occasions on which individual delegations tried to raise the idea of discussing trade and labor standards in the GATT. That was greeted with a large degree of skepticism, particularly by developing countries who were worried that the effort here would really be to deny them the one element of comparative advantage which they had. And so nothing really resulted from these initial contacts. I even remember being present at a sidebar meeting in Punta del Este where the Uruguay round was launched in 1986. I was invited to a small lunch hosted by the US Undersecretary of Labor at that time to talk about the extent to which work on trade and labor issues could take place in parallel to the negotiations that were about to be launched, and perhaps also be introduced into those negotiations. So these issues have been there for some time. I think it's then worth noting, then things began to accelerate somewhat, and it's worth just spending a moment to look at the agreement establishing the World Trade Organization. And the preamble to that agreement really picks up again, of course, on the labor issues and the importance of raising living standards. But it adds in for the first time, building on the sort of idea about natural resources that was present in Article 20 of the GATT, the idea that all of the purpose of this agreement is partly aimed at seeking both to protect and preserve the environment and to enhance the means for doing so in a manner consistent with their respective needs and concerns at different levels of economic development. So, and of course, a lot of the interpretations of disputes in the GATT relating to these kinds of matters have touched on the meaning of what that preamble is about. But it was clearly turning a page and setting a new standard on those matters. Of course, in the NAFTA negotiations, which took place about the same time, we wound up with really quite highly developed parallel agreements dealing with labor and environment. And a lot has been made of why are these parallel agreements and why were they not, why did the general dispute settlement provisions of the NAFTA itself not apply to these matters? The reason is really rather more historical than for any high policy purpose. And that was that the original NAFTA agreement had been completed when President Clinton was elected and said that he would only submit the NAFTA to Congress for approval if it was complemented with provisions that dealt with labor and environment. And so neither Canada nor the Mexicans had any real interest in seeing the United States completely reopen the NAFTA agreement at that stage. So we agreed to the idea that we would be prepared to try to negotiate parallel disciplines, provided that the NAFTA itself was not reopened. So that's what happened there. But clearly that was a major step forward in terms of having these issues very much associated with trade agreements and trying to address the issue that governments would not be allowed to undermine labor and environmental protections and try and attract business away from disciplines where these matters were dealt with through more stringent regulation.
If I may, John, I want to bring in John B. To just jump in there because of the link to NAFTA and the CUMSA, and maybe you guys can have a bit of a discussion. But John B., if you can build on John W.'s comments on some of the tangible examples that provide those of how ESG-related factors, again, anything can be thrown under the umbrella now, are surfacing in our current legislation and our treaties. I mentioned this CUMSA before, Customs Tariffs Act, you can touch on. And is that lens being applied consistently? And I know John W. and Meredith will want to jump in as well on that.
Yeah, I think there's actually a few areas now in the law and regulation where we're seeing the rubber hit the road on these factors. And ESG is not just a nice to have or part of a policy or public relations or government relations department in your organization. I do think we're now seeing tangible aspects of it incorporated into laws and trade laws, which is my area of practice. And certainly the biggest area is what you're alluding to, Sharon, which is the implementation of a prohibition on imports into Canada that are made in whole or in part from forced labor. That was implemented as a result of Canada's obligations under the USMCA, which had replaced NAFTA and took effect on July 1st, 2020. The US has been a leader, I would say, in the area of enforcing this rule in the United States. Canada, I think, is still a bit behind, but the law is on the books. And I think it's going to be one of the big sleeper issues for a lot of Canadian importers because there's a prohibition on importing it. But if you do import a product that's made in whole or in part from forced labor, you are prohibited from distributing it in Canada, and there are abilities of customs authorities under our Customs Act to seize that product. So there are very serious consequences to it. I don't think a lot of Canadian companies are on top of that issue yet. We see reports from time to time in the media about tomato paste products, clothing products, gloves, medical gloves being made and in a fashion where in the supply chain there was some element of forced labor in there. So I think that's really forcing Canadian companies now to take a very close look at their supply chain. The other area, of course, is sanctions, and we can get into a discussion of that. But since 2017, Canada has implemented authorities in its sanctions legislation that allow them to target individuals or entities that are involved in acts of significant corruption or human rights violations. That was a big step. It was done with our Magnitsky Act, but it was also, these authorities were implemented into our Special Economic Measures Act. And it is being used now to target individuals and organizations around the world. And certainly we're experiencing the challenges with that right now with the Russia sanctions, where Canada has targeted or listed hundreds, probably more than the EU and the US, hundreds of individuals and organizations. Again, from a policy point of view, our criminal law, our law generally does not have jurisdiction over these bad actors, but if we list them under sanctions, it's a way to still punish, maybe change behavior. I know we can have a debate over that, but we're seeing that trend increase over the last few years. And I think, again, companies looking at their supply chain need to be very carefully reviewing it to ensure they're not dealing with these listed entities or entities owned or controlled by them. Sharon, you also mentioned the legislation working its way through the Senate right now here in Canada, our Modern Slavery Act, which is going to require companies to report on the due diligence they're undertaking to ensure that in their supply chain there is no use of forced labor or child labor. And it's also going to implement a prohibition on the importation of goods made in whole or in part from child labor. So that's going to be new. That kind of due diligence reporting scheme is built very much on the same model we have in force right now under the Extractive Sector Transparency Measures Act, which requires companies in the resource sector to report on all the payments they're making to government. So that is moving along as well. The other final area I'd mention is export controls. We've seen recent amendments to the Export and Import Permits Act, which now require the government, mandates the government to consider issues of humanitarian law, human rights law, potential violence to women or children, gender-based violence, all factors they have to consider when they're going to be issuing a permit for technology transfer, export, or brokering of control goods on our export control list.
Thanks, John B. That was
my 5 minutes.
You did, and that was very concise. So, Meredith, I want to bring you in because, John B. touched on whether these measures that are being undertaken, and he brought up Russia, so why not, target that, are actually being used as they were intended, and what's the purpose? So, maybe a twofold question. I hope you draw out. One, why are we doing this, i.e. why are we incorporating the ESG lens into trade policy? And which one comes first? Is it the trade, or is it advancing the values that are embedded in the ESG policy? And with all that's happening in Russia right now, can you draw out, except for the humanitarian crisis that's occurring and the security issues, what are the trade related issues that are relevant? So I hope you can answer that, because in my mind, those that were already applying the ESG lens as a risk tool perhaps should have seen that, should have factored in Putin, should have factored in the fact that it's an autocracy, and have assumed a level of risk that that government brings if they were applying the ESG tools already given to them. So what's new in all of this?
Okay, that's a big question. I'll do my best. And I'm gonna take a step back, start kind of where I think ESG in trade is recently, and then get to Russia at the end maybe. So when I think about where the ESG agenda is with respect to trade right now, the first point I would make is that I think the two most promising topics in this area are labor and environment. And to be honest, they haven't actually gained a lot of momentum in the mainstream until quite recently. So I did some joint research on the evolution of Canada's labor provisions in all of its trade agreements. And, starting with NAFTA, ending with USMCA, and looking at everything in between. And what you see is this very slow and gradual incremental improvement of labor provisions over time. And this was actually largely a nonpartisan, non-controversial activity advanced by officials. But for a country like Canada, that's an advanced economy, a lot of these labor provisions haven't actually achieved very much domestically. The focus has really been on improving labor standards among trade partners like Honduras and Mexico, and only then if the agreements were enforced. But for countries like the US and Canada, these labor chapters haven't really been very progressive. They don't raise the bar on what we're doing at home. But this kind of very slow and incremental progress that we saw, I think, got a real shot in the arm more recently when rich countries began to recognize that there's a protectionist advantage to using labor and environment and these kind of values in trade to reshore jobs and production to their own economies. So this is where that trade, is it trade or is it values? And this is, I think, where we're seeing the change. So, we've had the US under both Trump and now Biden using ESG language on labor union rights in Mexico to reshore American jobs. And President Biden's 2022 trade agenda was just released last week, and it's very strongly focused on enforcement, particularly around labor. And so what we've seen is this American-led shift away from approaching labor and environment through cooperation and kind of mutual standard raising, and instead moving very much towards enforcement and penalties for non-compliance. And so I do want to highlight one thing that I think is really important in all of this and that we can't lose sight of, and John just mentioned it as well, is that I think that what Canada does in this space is very constrained by US ambition or lack of it. So I have a co-authored article coming out in the Canadian Tax Journal soon that focuses on carbon border adjustments, which are basically taxes on imports to account for carbon emissions and carbon pricing. And last year, the EU announced that it will introduce a CBA. And so this led to all kinds of attention in Canada. What does this mean? And, I don't want to dismiss the legitimate policy goal around reducing incentives around carbon leakage, because it's there for sure. But there's this strong protectionist undercurrent that creates support in corners that you don't expect it, including Republican USA. So for rich countries with carbon taxes, CBAs can be introduced as a way to raise the cost of imported goods, just like John Weeks said, taking away that comparative advantage of developed countries. And so, one of our conclusions of that paper was that unless the United States is on board with this, we're we're really not able to do very much in Canada with respect to a CBA. 76% of our exports to the US, 58% of our imports from the US are in these carbon intensive sectors, which are the sectors that we expect to be targeted by a CBA. And this contrasts with the EU, which is our next biggest partner that's really leading the global push on this. It only 4% of our exports and 11% of our imports are in these same kind of carbon intensive industries. So what that means is that, we have to have a very global approach when we think about these issues, but the United States really has to be front and center, because if we were to proceed with something like that without the Americans, we might as well literally invite the Americans to unwind the North American supply chain. So as I think about those kinds of issues and I situate them with Russia, I think that what is possible in the next little while is that we are going to see an even greater acceleration, but also kind of a reframing of the ESG agenda around other broader values issues that we haven't thought about in the same way. So human rights, to the point you raised, Sharon, has been around for a long time. Forced labor was already kind of a policy item underway, but are we going to start seeing rules around democracies and a Western security alliance, for instance? And when you start to put that kind of lens on ESG, many sectors are potentially impacted. You've got critical minerals produced in countries using enslaved child labor, going into ZEV batteries that use those minerals. Is that all kind of out the window? Are we going to start reframing and getting those inputs from places like Canada that have strong and good labor and environment standards? So, one of the ironies that I kind of anticipate around this is that the progressive trade agenda and some of these ESG issues, I think, came from a very positive, inclusive orientation around encouraging cooperation, making the world a better place, and so on. And I actually anticipate that this could potentially all be usurped very, very quickly by sort of the foreign policy school of realism in a totally different direction.
Thanks, Meredith. And I know this leads us to, I hope, a bit of a dialogue between the three of you in which you will violently either disagree or resoundingly agree. I hope it's the former, because that'd be more interesting. And let me go back to the sanctions. I think the response, as we indicated earlier, on Russia from the corporate world and also from the general international community is quite interesting. And I am often wondering if we have left as a community enough room to maneuver next time another country invades another country, or next time there is, and Meredith, you touched on this, next time there is an affront to our ethical values and international security, essentially, be it a ship coming into the Arctic or the Baltic Sea, whatever have you. But does the Russian situation and the use of sanctions and the company's response in terms of pulling out and essentially divesting of any ties to Russia, does that establish a precedent that will influence A, trade policy in the future, and B, does it require us to review the recently executed trade agreements with that lens? Because there's a couple of things. One is divesting because it doesn't meet your value chain and applying it writ large. The other is that behavioral change that you've written about, Meredith, before. How do you actually the other aspect of behavioral change is promoting human rights within a country, or demonstrating best practice through cooperation. And John W. also touched on this. So maybe if I ask that question in terms of leaving ourselves enough room to maneuver, to John W. first, and then because I'd love your views on that, and then we can hit some of the Q&As that are coming in from the audience as well.
Well, I think that this is the whole-scale Russian invasion of the Ukraine is really almost a unique situation. I mean, this is the first time we've seen anything like this since the Second World War, particularly in Europe. And so I'm not sure that we need to worry about the actions taken in response to that becoming a precedent. for other more minor things. And also, of course, I think it's already becoming rapidly clear that that these restrictions and actions and sanctions also punish the countries that are taking them. It's just that we've decided that this is such a serious situation that we're prepared to suffer the collateral damage, at least for now. But you can already see how reluctant countries, including the United States and European countries, are, for instance, to stop oil imports from Russia. And this would be the one thing where, you know, the rubber would really meet the road, together with the banking sanctions and the SWIFT action. But I do think that we're going to see a continued use of trade actions. I thought that along the lines of what Meredith suggested, I agree very much with what Meredith said. So do we need to give some further thought to how we refine some of the trade agreements we already have? Perhaps. I think one of the mistakes we made with the original NAFTA was not treating it as it had been negotiated as a sort of living document where we would evolve disciplines going forward. It was such a political hot potato in the United States and to some extent in Canada that we just decided to leave it the way it was. And of course, it gradually became less and less relevant to the new circumstances that were developing, and finally fell victim to President Trump. And I think, you know, that we should. I know efforts are underway now to try and make sure that we avoid that same mistake this time round. That we're looking at how do we have vigorous work programs in all the areas of the agreement and look at where changes might be necessary. So perhaps some of the possible changes could be looked at in that context.
I just quickly add to that thought that our current trade agreements, the trading regime we're operating under, already has exceptions built into them that allow for us to take measures like economic sanctions. And so the national security exception in GATT 1994, which forms part of the WTO agreements, countries can rely on that when they take measures like sanctions. Now that security exception has been abused in certain cases, and from time to time you get a kind of Helms-Burton black swan where they claim that they're doing it on the basis of national security. That is problematic. But for the most part, economic sanctions fall within that exception. And even when Chrystia Freeland announced that they were no longer granting MFN treatment to Belarus and Russia on tariffs being applied to imports into Canada, so they're now at 35%, like North Korean product is at 35%. They were relying on the national national security exception, in our trade agreements to be able to do that. And I think now this is a great test of that. The Russia sanctions program is the largest, most impactful sanctions program, I think, in Canadian history, certainly, and probably for the other Western countries as well. Even though it's not a full trade embargo on Russia, the impact across the financial services sector and the energy sector is so great that I can't think of anything in recent memory that has been so significant on the sanctions side. And so far it's standing up to the test. But I do think this event, and I agree with John, it's not going to set some kind of unusual precedent in that it itself is a very unusual circumstance that we haven't seen since World War II. So I don't fear that measures we're using against Russia now are somehow going to be used in an abusive fashion in the future against other countries.
Yeah, I would just I agree with both those things. So I'm sorry, Sharon, we're not giving you the sparking debate that you want. I do think that this is a real sea change in international affairs, and it's going to have cascading effects across all policy files. You know, I think about inflation and the impact that could potentially have on the future of the carbon tax. I mean, from domestic to trade files, this is a very big time in history. And I agree that at the moment, sanctions that are rolling out are reflecting a goal by the West to do everything and anything possible to try to impact the behavior of Putin or oligarch influential networks to then pressure him to change. And so I'm not sure the extent to which the full impact is even known, but we have collectively decided that it's worth doing those things. One discussion that I start to see the beginnings of among trade experts is, what will the conditions be for potentially relaxing sanctions, removing sanctions, these kinds of things. My own view is it's far too early for that conversation, that we're still in the process of ratcheting up, not thinking about removing them. But as I think about even the comments by Alan Burson around the closure of the Canada-US border as a result of COVID, one of the things that wasn't done is conditions were not set at the time that we closed the border to determine when would we reach the point at reopening. So, from a policy perspective, I think trade wonks like to think about these questions, but I kind of feel like it's too soon to really even go down that road. I have to admit that in terms of what could this look like in the future, I was actually quite surprised at the efficiency with which Canada was able to remove MFN status for Russia. I was like, probably many of us at this conference today going through all of the legislation, trying to figure out how, the legal basis for invoking these, this, where did it come from? And I was actually surprised at the relative ease with which Canada is able to do this. That doesn't actually extend to all of our trade partners. Some of them have to meet a higher threshold to do that. So, that's just kind of a unique Canadian piece, but I would agree with both of them that this is a very big event, unprecedented in a very long time, and so I'm not sure we know what the end game is at this point.
Well, I'm not one to give up, so I'm going to find a point of disagreement between you guys. We have 9 minutes, so I'm going to take the two questions that have come up, and I'm going to combine them because they are relevant to ESG, and they're talking about development of natural resources. Essentially, the questions are, with the recent push by countries on ESG, these same countries were the ones that minted a lot of dough from uncontrolled exploitation of their oil patch. And perhaps I can link that with the conversation that you were just having, which was, you referenced Germany in terms of turning off the taps. But there has been a resurgence and a reemergence of the conversation about Canada's oil and gas exports and production, and the fact that our goals are net zero by 2050, and to get there we would need to advance renewables. We would need to decrease our reliance on natural resources. But we have Germany, for instance, firing up its coal plants. Potentially, I haven't read about the nuclear, but they had a nuclear policy on that as well. And then, when we're talking about what some Canadians have been saying about oil and gas production in Canada, which is essentially we have the ESG advantage. We produce it in a more environmentally sustainable way. We respect human rights. We're not an autocracy at sometimes. And so with that in mind, in terms of the debate about whether climate change goals to advance getting to net zero, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which would necessitate the transitioning out from our natural resources. And now you have the security issues and the question. I'm curious as to what your take is on that, in terms of, do you see a re-emergence of investments into non-renewables, or perhaps, in my view, it could, to create security, you see it in the other way, which is ensuring that next time some crisis like this hits, you can bring on renewable energy on top more quickly. So curious to understand, what are the implications from an export perspective of oil and gas from Canada? And what does that mean? Who wants to take that first? John B is unmuted, and John W put his hand up. So I'm going to go with John W. I'm going to be a little biased, John B. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I think that major events have a habit of sort of upsetting the policy apple cart from time to time, and can have an impact on changing what are relative priorities. When we're talking about climate change too, I think it's important to go back and think that, we're trying to get to global net zero. It's not that we're trying, each country has its own goals, but I think a major international crisis like this perhaps suggests that we need to go back and talk with some of our partners about how we might make certain adjustments in the short term while still maintaining where we're going to get to. I mean, for instance, if the European Union is going to start burning a lot more coal, wouldn't it be better if Canada and the United States ship them more natural gas, which is no longer coming from Russia? I mean, in that time frame. Again, I think people are going to have to look. Obviously, we attach a lot of priority to deterring major aggression, military aggression, and that's clear already in how quickly we've responded in this case. So I would say yes. We should be prepared to consider increasing production of clean fossil fuels in Canada on a short-term basis in order to assist our European allies, both from a strategic international military point of view, but also from the point of view of allowing them to continue more smoothly on the road to achieving their own net zero targets.
John B.
Yeah, I mean, Canadian oil.
Don't agree with me.
Canadian oil is ethical oil, and frankly, these are things that should have been taken into account 10, 20 years ago when we were thinking about building pipelines, not now, especially in the context of the termination of the Keystone pipeline. I'm not sure how much can be done in the short term now. And in a way, hopefully this is going to be a lesson for when this happens in the future, that we need to be a lot more careful about, especially on the ESG side, jumping off the deep end in terms of how we treat Canadian energy resources. And we're learning now I don't want to be too negative about it, but I just don't see that there can be much in the short term done with Canadian resources. But I mean, look at what the US is doing now. They are now talking about relaxing sanctions on Iran and Venezuela so they can release more oil into the international system. And it that would have been unheard of. I think even when people contemplated an invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I think if you ask them, would we have been relaxing sanctions against Iran and Venezuela, they would have said no. I think we're in a bit of a shocking position now that we're resorting to now having to relax sanctions against other bad actors so we can properly allocate energy resources. And if anything, at the very minimum, let this be a lesson that for the future, we need to be in a much stronger position to be able to provide ethical Canadian natural resources to our neighbors, not just to the south, but around the world.
You failed again, Sharon.
No one's going to disagree with that.
Well, look, I mean, I'm on the record of having written that I think that so long as the world is relying on fossil fuels, there's no reason they shouldn't be coming from Canada. I don't agree with the position that we constrain our own natural resource capacity when we're potentially reopening with. When the U.S. is looking at reopening with Venezuela, for instance, I don't agree with that position at all. To Gary Kasparov, the famous chess player, has been very outspoken about Russia for many, many years. And one of the things that he said, I think the day that Russia invaded, was that the Keystone pipeline should be resumed because there are immediate threats. And while climate change poses an existential threat sometime in the future, there are immediate existential threats facing the world today. And so I think we'll agree on that. What I would add to this is that, you know, Canadian prosperity relies on oil and gas exports. Like that is a huge, it is our #1 trade category. And so as I think about, you know, Canada's move to the Indo-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific pivot, how we want to diversify, you know, what does the Indo-Pacific want from us? They want oil and gas. They want natural resources. They want critical minerals. And so this is a problem that Canada needs to sort out, whether we situate it with respect to events unfolding in Ukraine, or whether we think about the longer term game. The world is pretty clear about what it wants to trade with Canada. And we need to have a very serious adult conversation here about what we want.
So the omnipresence of Colin has appeared, which tells us that, you know, we are out of time. Thank you so much. As I said earlier, I think, you know, this panel could go on for hours and everybody still would be listening in. The only thing I want to leave you with, because, you know, I fail to get you to disagree, is that we can have it both ways. I believe we can address climate change and the risk that it presents and promote energy security, because the whole point, as I understand it, of trade, and especially after World War II, was to promote peace and security. And those two factors will come up once the impacts of climate change on those underdeveloped countries especially are coming up. So I think there needs to be more of a conversation. Colin, you need another panel and a longer one to discuss that. So with that, thank you again, and I hand it over to Colin.
Sharon, thank you very much. You may not have got the panel to disagree much, but it was certainly stimulating and interesting. And as you say, we need another panel, and we could have had more time with this. I felt that there was an appreciation of realism. John Weeks taking us back to the origins, the Havana Charter, and the whole purpose of trade, in part to raise living standards. I think we shouldn't forget that. And living standards, part of that is living in a free and, I think, democratic world. And of course, that takes us to a whole host of issues that we've tried to address: the ESG side, forced labor, and of course the extraordinary situation we're in today, and how do democracies react to this. And I couldn't help thinking, listening to Meredith and to John Boskerell and John Boskerell talking about our arsenal of trade legislation, which is really impressive when you think about it and how quickly we were able to move. But a reminder to me that, you know, we live in the world as it is, not as some wish it would be. And that's something I think Canadians are going to have to take into account, especially when we have these resources. And you've got to make the trade-offs, which you, Sharon, very adroitly in your moderation of this panel pointed out. So, as you say, Sharon, much more to be discussed on this one, but it sets the stage for our final panel of today. And that's going to include John Manley and Gary Dewar. So I'd invite John and Gary to join moderator Maureen Boyd on the stage for a discussion of managing the politics of values and trade. We've talked this morning about many aspects of trade, but we've dealt with the public policy side. But I think it was really important, I felt important when we set this up, and confessed talking with John Manley, who's chair of our advisory council, saying, well, we've got to get the politics of it. Now, as many of you may have seen, we'd hope to have Jean Charest join this, but Jean Charest is, as many of us know, engaged in public policy and practical politics in another matter. So I'm delighted, though, that Maureen is going to have a discussion with John Manley and with Gary Dewar on the politics of managing values and trade. Maureen, over to you.
Thanks, Colin, and thanks again to CJI for organizing another excellent State of the Trade. As Colin just said, we listened to an excellent session on values and trade, and now we're going to have a discussion on managing the politics of values and trade. And it's obvious and sad that this topic is timely and relevant, and with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we're living through what's really a visible demonstration of managing the politics of values and trade. As we heard from Franz Paquette earlier, Canada has joined with most countries in sanctioning trade with Russia over its breach of international law. In Canada's case, these are additional sanctions to those we applied when Russia invaded eastern Ukraine and annexed Crimea in 2014. So the application of sanctions in the case of Russia is straightforward, but even so, our European allies, at least for now, have exempted the energy and agricultural products that they depend on from the embargo. So we're fortunate to be able to talk about political decisions with the Honorable John Manley and the Honorable Gary Doer. Both have had to deal with the politics of values and interests when it comes to trade. John, as we all know, served as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Foreign Affairs and Industry, and then later as CEO of the Business Council of Canada. Gary served as Premier of Manitoba and then as our ambassador to the United States. Welcome to both of you. I'm going to start with John and then Gary jump in. And I really want to start right with the political calculations. On the one hand, you're faced with economic issues of Canadian consumers and Canadian producers, the jobs they generate, the effect on the Canadian economy. On the other hand is our commitment to fundamental democratic values and demands of civil society seeking sanctions. So how do you make the political calculations?
Well, I think first, Maureen, it's important to recognize that not every situation is identical. We had a coordinated coordinated effort on sanctions in the apartheid era, South Africa. I think the broad consensus is that they were successful at that time in gradually squeezing South Africa until it became clear that its best interest, including for its minority white population, was not in isolation, but in engaging with the global community. I have to say that most subsequent efforts at sanctioning, for whatever good, right, or moral cause, have been less successful. One to point to is the sanctions, much less rigorous than those imposed today, that were brought in against Russia after its invasion of Crimea in 2014. And I think you would have to say that those sanctions had, for all practical purposes, zero effect. So I think the lesson for a country like Canada, which, in these things tends to be a policy taker rather than a policy maker, is you might say we need to hunt in packs. We need to have lots of company. We don't affect anything by being, as we were once described, the nagging ant of the global community, shaking our fingers and telling people what to do, and threatening Canada's retaliation through trade measures if they don't. We're effective when we're part of a broad global community, as we are at the present time in this Russian situation. And there, I think Canadians will see how generally supportive they are as gas prices continue to rise, recognizing that a large measure of that is brought on by sanctions, which in theory they support. If sanctions are imposed by somebody else against something that we don't agree with, we're usually supportive. When they actually impact us, then it becomes our own interests that are being compromised. Are Canadians willing to live with that for a while? I think that we will see. But I think right now, in the heat of the moment, the global community is very united on this. And I don't think, therefore, that it's much of, I think the politics are clear, both in Canada and I would venture to say in the United States, that this strong reaction is justified and warranted. And the compromise in, supply chains, in pricing, in costs, and so on, are going to be accepted by the broad body politic.
Gary, jump in.
Well, I just want to start by saying thanks, Maureen, for setting up our panel. I hope we can enlighten everyone on a few items. I appreciate it. I had the pleasure of working with John when he was head of the Business Council on Trans-Pacific Partnership. I also had the privilege of working with him when I was Premier on the border agreements. He reached with Tom Ridge. Both were very positive. I also worked with Jean Charest, who I know is preoccupied with another decision to make in his career, but he was instrumental in leading our discussions on the European trade agreement, and he dragged me along to Brussels to convince the Europeans that the premiers were absolutely committed to a European trade agreement that had reciprocity on provincial procurement, which included hydro and health, which were very important for our European friends. The question of sanctions was raised. I was in Mexico City, just south of Mexico City, 2 days after with the leaders, 2 days after the invasion of Crimea. And I would have to say that the majority of the discussion that I heard, I wasn't always in the room with the three leaders, was focused in on the concern we had for the Ukrainian people and the worry we had about any kind of military action leading to a potential nuclear war with an adversary that has a lot of nuclear weapons. Of course, the sanctions that did come in after that were modest, I think, by comparison of what's going on today. And I certainly believe, as John has stated, that there's a great deal of public support for the sanctions. I think there's a large understanding of the pain it will inflict upon our own citizens, but I think the public opinion in Canada is overwhelmingly supporting the fight of the Ukrainian people to keep their sovereignty, to keep their independence, to keep their lives and livelihoods in their own country. And I think that that is the overwhelming political situation in the country, which is also the right moral place to be.
So are trade sanctions the only remedy, the right remedy, the most effective form of sanctions? Just in terms of the toolkit.
Well, I'll just start by saying sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. Hopefully they will work with the present situation with Ukraine and Russia. The question is, how much pain does Russia feel, how quickly, and what is going to be the off-ramp for this horrible invasion and for the decimation of a lot of the infrastructure and the loss of life in Ukraine. And I'm hoping that we can find that in the next couple of weeks, we can find an off-ramp for the people of Ukraine and the people, the Russian administration, not the people of Russia. And that'll be crucial. I've seen sanctions be more PR than real in the past. I probably was involved in some of those, perhaps, but I do remember sanctions working in the Canada-US trade environment. I remember that, for example, we threatened sanctions on country of origin legislation after being very unsuccessful, and we targeted California wine, and we targeted Michigan manufacturers of furniture, and we switched the vote in California from 0 votes in Congress to 45, and finally got it over 300, so we could get rid of what we consider to be protectionist measures. But in other cases, sometimes sanctions don't work. And any threats we've had lately on softwood lumber, unfortunately, has not worked.
I think Gary makes the really important point about what is the off-ramp here. I think I'm no psychologist, but it looks to me like there is no easy off-ramp for Vladimir Putin and his immediate circle of support. I consider the likelihood of a regime change in Russia to be very low, certainly below 50%. And therefore, at the end of this, we all admire, I think, the courage and the determination, the sheer gutsiness of the Ukrainians that are resisting what appears to be an irresistible force, certainly in terms of numbers and weapons and so on. And those of us that have been to Ukraine know, I live in Ottawa. Kiev could be Ottawa. It's a lovely city. It's got shopping malls and residential, subdivisions and government buildings, and it's been a nice city, and the people there are contemplating urban warfare. And you know, we haven't seen that in a modern, Western country in many, many decades. So I admire them and I respect them, and I think we need to do everything we can to be supportive of them. But this will not end well. The force is irresistible, and so when we get to the point where the shooting stops, we have to ask ourselves, what is the likely state of play then? I think it's possible to see a situation in which continued resistance occurs. The Ukrainians are not, and I don't know how Russia thinks they're going to manage an occupied state of that size and that population. But at some point, they will take Kiev. They will appoint a government that will immediately negotiate a treaty with the Russians, which will give them everything that they want. It will be a vassal state, and then they will attempt to impose some kind of authority structure within the state in order to control actions. Have the Ukrainians, learned from the Russian behavior in World War II and simply pulled back toward the West and continued to confront? Possibly that level of action could go on for some time, but eventually it will end. And personally, I see it as being very difficult for the West to allow a post-invasion Russia that controls the Ukraine back into the global community. I think they become a pariah state like North Korea until this ends, which means we're in this for the long haul, Maureen.
That's what I was just going to say. So you're basically saying that trade sanctions are going to, and other sanctions are going to continue for a long time. Let's just broaden the discussion a little bit away from, we could talk about Ukraine and Russia all day, but while I've got you here, as former politicians, I wanted to raise some other examples, like take forced labor and human rights abuses. How far do we go in using trade sanctions to demonstrate our social and governance concerns? You talked about every case being different, and so, but are we being hypocritical when we allow the sale of light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia, and where and when we don't place export controls on the sale of arms? Gary, do you want to start with that one?
Well, it's a very difficult situation because I think the original intent of the vehicles was to be for domestic use only, and then they became part of the what was going on in Yemen, which I don't believe. Again, I'm not in Ottawa, and I wasn't working after the situation developed in Yemen on this file, but I do know that Canada was competing with, I think London, Ontario was competing with Wisconsin to get that contract. But I thought at the time it was only for domestic use. Now I don't know whether there's wording to that to enforce that, but obviously the intent of domestic use looks to be different than the reality of the vehicles being used, as I understand it, in Yemen. But again, I'm a long way away from it, from my previous 2 jobs as premier and ambassador. There are some times where the environment in Canada is very, very helpful for trade. I know that in the context of the Buy American provisions that were brought in on the Recovery Act in 2009, the fact that we had a strong labor movement in Canada, the fact that organized labor, what leadership existed in the United States and equally in Canada, allowed us to get a waiver from the Buy American provisions based on that value in Canada. And Mexico was not invited at that time because of the issue of labor standards in their country. Now, hopefully that's improved with the latest agreement for the people of Mexico and for workers in Mexico. But sometimes our values and our structure in our own society is helpful. And actually, at the time, Joe Biden was in charge of the Recovery Act as vice president. He was very close to the hard hats in the United States, and I think he remains that way. So I like to use labor as an advantage, even though it's also a proud tradition in both our countries to have a strong labor movement as part of raising the opportunities in the middle class in our two countries.
So, John, it's a hypothetical question, but how far do we go in using trade sanctions to demonstrate our concerns?
Well, again, I'd stress that I think it's good for us to keep track of what company we're in when we impose these rules, and I think it's also important for us to understand exactly who our friends are and who we're prepared to invest in. This is, I mean, did we need the Russians to tell us that this is a really nasty world that we live in? And apparently maybe we did, because a lot of the global order and stability that we've counted upon for many decades now is strained. And sometimes we need to make pragmatic decisions on issues of peace and security, and because you're particularly going to the issue of export permits for military equipment and hardware, that on one level you could say no, we don't want war. We don't want war. We don't, and that's true. We don't want war. We don't want conflict. And if we could just live in a world where there was no war and no conflict, then we wouldn't have a problem with export permits for military equipment, because we wouldn't be making it. But unfortunately, that's not where we live. And we maintain a capacity, limited though it may be, for the production of equipment and supplies that are needed to be used by our armed forces. And we achieve some scale in doing that by selling them to other countries that also need them. And I think we want to be very circumspect about how we impose limitations on friendly countries with whom we do other business, and whose governments we count on to maintain a regional stability. Because our influence in the world is more effective through engagement than it is through withdrawal and lectures.
Mm-hmm. Do you see like-minded countries using trade sanctions to discipline nations that aren't meeting their climate commitment? There's going to be increasing pressure to adopt border adjustment taxes, for example. We have a carbon tax, but other countries do not.
Well, again, I think that this will work if there's a critical mass of countries that are engaged in doing the same thing. But for Canada to do it alone, when we're less than 2% of the global economy, it may make some of us feel good, but it won't have an impact on the outcome, and it will increase our costs and reduce our standards of living accordingly. So, our effectiveness in making something like that work is dependent on our diplomatic skill in persuading others, especially major economies, to get on board with the same approach. So that we're so that we hunt in packs, as I say.
Just, I also believe we should start in North America. I think there's I believe that when I was in Washington, in Washington and Ottawa and Canada and United States are similar that the battle on environment and cleaner air and cleaner water is, against jobs and reliability of energy is a battle of one-trick ponies. And what we have got to do, and we did it to some degree with light vehicle emission standards that the late Jim Prentice helped negotiate with the United States based on what started off in California and was adopted by provinces, including Quebec and British Columbia, Manitoba, and others. We went to a light energy efficiency as the starting point to a North American agreement on climate change. And I think we should take it, we've proposed before that rather than just talking a pipeline in the morning and cleaner air and cleaner water in the afternoon, we should be working together on methane gas rules. We should be working together on energy efficiency. And it's not just for oil, it's really difficult to build a transmission line from Canada to the United States. I remember advising Hydro-Quebec that we were having real trouble in New Hampshire. And I think it's never been approved in New Hampshire. We got a presidential permit in New York, but couldn't get it in New Hampshire. And of course, people in Boston and the governor of Massachusetts still wants hydroelectric power, but we couldn't get approval of a transmission line. So whether it's a pipeline or renewable energy on a transmission line, we should have a broad agenda of clean energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and reliability in North America for energy. And I think we have the ability to do that. And I think that could be a model for the world. But if we do it just one project by one project, we'll get nowhere. We'll have no broader results. We'll just have narrow skirmishes that result in not a broader policy for the benefit of the public good, in my view.
All right, thank you. So the panel before, and Meredith Lilly in particular, talked about the pressure to negotiate trade agreements that incorporate ESG goals. And well, we tried to do that with China, who basically told us to forget about it, and the agreement collapsed. And David Morrison talked earlier about negotiating agreements with Indonesia, ASEAN countries, Taiwan. What do you see happening there?
Well, you just, sometimes when we negotiate trade agreements that have some real benefit, for example, on labor, on human rights, on human trafficking, state-owned enterprise, the TPP agreement, once it was negotiated, nobody went out and sold the benefits of labor, environment, human trafficking, rules on state-owned enterprise. This being hopefully the model for eventually China, if they wanted to agree to it, to come into that agreement. It just became a battle of, are you for trade, free trade, or you're against it? And oftentimes, even with NAFTA, when a company goes from a second shift to a third shift in Ohio or Ontario, we don't say it's partly because of trade. It becomes a battle again of you're either for it or you're against it, rather than the benefits of trade. But I do think trade agreements like TPP, which dealt with intellectual property and data protection, also can have real benefits for humankind. But you got to go out and sell those benefits. If people don't know about them, they're not going to support it unless opponents of all trade come in and allow those agreements to get nullified, or in the case of Trump, signed away.
There's a comment and a question I'm going to from our audience. Canada needs to dramatically shift domestic emphasis on expanding Canadian business opportunities internationally. How can we generate urgency within Canadian businesses to advance their products and services abroad? We need to have our trade commissioner on here, but as politicians, take a stab.
Well, and I spent my 9 years as head of the Business Council, and we were constantly talking about where the opportunities were abroad, and the reality is, and I think this is, if you look at the economic literature, you'll find this is true, that trade is very geographically weighted. So international trade is always going to be most active in where the geographical challenges are the least. So we have a highly integrated economy with the United States. And since NAFTA, increasingly with Mexico, and Canadian companies are big investors and are very active in exploiting those trade opportunities. For sure, less so in Asia or in perhaps in Europe. But you could say there's quite a lot of geopolitical tension between Japan and China. Well, who is Japan's largest trading partner? It's China. They're close. It just makes sense. So I don't disparage Canadian business on this score, as some do, because I think actually they're doing exactly what makes sense for them to do. And the challenge for us is when we get adversity in Washington, as Gary had to deal with for a while, it's challenging for Canadian companies that are heavily reliant on that market. So we need to develop other opportunities. But going to Asia, going to Europe, going to Latin America requires scale and investment and patience and time. And if I would say there's one thing that we have lacked in the Canadian business context is, well, we're really good at starting companies. And while we love to talk about small business, we're not that good at scaling them up. And if there's one thing we could do, it's to drive that scale so that we have more companies that are equipped with the patience and capital and resources to go farther abroad than the nearshoring opportunities in the United States.
Maureen, one of the things I think that is a bit of a cultural advantage in Canada on trade, we're very unified across party lines. If you look at Jean Chrétien, Prime Minister Chrétien, in his Team Canada trips and to various countries with premiers, Prime Minister Harper, was my experience with him working on the European Trade Agreement, which, as I said, was led by Jean Charest on behalf of the premiers. We had New Democrats, Conservatives, Liberals, premiers all working together on removing Buy America with the business community, with mayors, with other individuals. So we actually do have a bit of a cultural advantage. We do have our disagreements, but there's a lot of unity on the kind of Canadian opportunities and the need for them, because we all recognize we don't have the largest population in the world, and we're fortunate enough to be next door to the largest purchaser of goods and services of any country in the world. God created us good partners, and with our geography, but you have to be unified to take advantage of it. I find I like the Team Canada trips where we had business, provinces, and the federal government all going together, working in unison on behalf of the citizens. I like that example, and of course that's where I learned that great political advice from Jean Chrétien, who states to all politicians, if you paint yourself in the corner, you walk over the paint. So we should also remember that as a good practice for any politician. And John Manley does a better imitation of Jean Chrétien than I do. He spent more time with him.
Feel free, John.
I'll watch for the opportunity.
Right, exactly. Wait for the opportunity. Yes, I mean, there's no doubt that it's obviously easier for Canadian businesses to expand south. We speak the same language and all of that. But I have a question that I want to phrase a bit. So it's axiomatic that business and government prefer stability. It's in our own self-interest, and it's easy for us to work in stable countries. But I want to know, why is the federal government and business not putting more money into funding democratic actors? And full disclosure, I'm chair of the Parliamentary Center that supports inclusive, effective democratic institutions abroad, including parliaments and legislators and civil society groups. And I know how hard it is to get money from both government and the private sector. Are we not being short-sighted?
Well, I'll bite. I'll agree with you, and I think it's also true of our broader overseas development assistance programs. But I can tell you, when I did the budget in 2000 and what year was that? 2003, I guess. I increased significantly our funding for overseas development assistance. And the Department of Finance, I understood, had this, they did these samples of, focus groups, I guess, but had these little dial things. So they would, while you were giving the budget speech, the population would dial up or dial down, whether they liked something or didn't like something, so that they got a quick read on it. So I had this part of the speech. You think that the armies of bureaucrats write that speech? I wrote a lot of that myself, and one line that I was very proud of had to do with overseas development assistance, and that is, to the effect that if we wanted to live in a world of peace, we had to be prepared to live in a world in which we contributed to the alleviation of poverty and conflict and governance. I'm sorry to tell you, Maureen, it got the lowest score in the speech. And so I agree with your statement that we're being short-sighted. And if I told you what kept me awake at night, there are two big things. One is the existential threat of climate change, and the other is global governance. But out in the, as I like to say, in the church basement in Saint Genevieve Parish in Ottawa South, their needs and their worries and their concerns are much closer to home. And so supporting international engagement is in some ways a difficult sell.
Gary, you need to unmute, Gary.
Oh, this is okay. Maureen, I can't give you much advice. Am I unmuted now? Yes.
You're
sorry. But I was very impressed when I was in Washington at the two bodies that were doing all kinds of international work supported by the Congress and the Senate and the White House. And they were both, I guess, populated by partisan people. I know I attended one annual meeting of the NDI, the Democratic Institute. It's actually got Canadians that help it and work with it. It was chaired by Madeleine Albright and was a tremendous profile in Washington. I know a comparable group that is run by the Republican group.
That's the IRA.
Okay, I didn't know the name of it.
Yeah.
True confessions, I only attended the NDI.
Surprise.
Just maybe I wasn't invited to the other one, but I had lots of Republican friends when I was working there. But I was very impressed with the work they did and with the work they're doing. And especially in terms of having volunteers attend to train people on running elections, on the ethics of elections, on voting, on monitoring and ensuring there's the integrity of the voting process. And sometimes at risk to people. There have been people that have lost their lives in the pursuit of democracy. But maybe we could learn something from our American friends to raise the profile and the benefits, not only to the countries that we would be acting with, but to Canada and the Canadian brand. So I'm suggesting you become the next Madeleine Albright.
Thanks. Well, as you know, the government has made a commitment to the Center for Peace, Order, and Good Government, which is going to be renamed as a democracy support. And we're hoping that that will come through. But in the meantime, the government gives more money in the last 15 years, has given way more money to IRI and NDI than to Canadian groups. So it's easier for them to write a check.
I did not know that.
Yes.
Okay.
We're running out of time. I have one last question here, and I apologize. I'm not asking every single question that has been raised in the chat group because I'm trying to keep this focusing on the politics and managing the politics. But there was one it's kind of related to what we're talking about. I'm just quoting directly. John is right. The post-Cold War order is strained. The question is, what caused this strain? Is it because we failed to uphold the promised peace dividend after collapse of the USSR? Either you want to take that one on or put it in the context of our last discussion on funding democratic actors abroad.
No, but I think a lot of things have happened since the collapse of the USSR. First of all, there was what has turned out to be people matter in governance and in world events, and there was a point in time when Boris Yeltsin stood on the top of a car and stopped the overthrow of the Soviet government led by Mikhail Gorbachev. And Yeltsin himself became president of Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. Many opportunities presented themselves then. We took some of them, but not all. But a very critical decision was made by Boris Yeltsin, and that was to name Vladimir Putin to a position of real power. So I think that was a critical point in time. I think that other things have happened. The development of social media, which I am happy to say, my time in politics, I never had to deal with it. But the division of our democratic societies into echo chambers where we only talk to people with whom we agree and we only hear from people with whom we agree, and where it's, as Senator Moynihan once said, that everyone was entitled to their own opinion, but they weren't entitled to their own facts. That's no longer the case, because people do seem to believe they're entitled to their own facts, no matter how outlandish some of those facts and theories seem to be. So I think there are a lot of things that have contributed to this. I don't have a lot of solutions to them, Maureen, because I think they are complex and difficult, and they differ society to society. I think since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I think a lesson the Chinese took from that was to be even more controlling. They didn't see the Russian democratic experiment as being one that they wanted to emulate. And the growth of China in the last 20 years has been one of the key factors. So there are so many things, and I worry because, in our time, Gary, you and I, we dealt with the odd crisis. I was asked by Prime Minister Chrétien to be front and center on 9/11. It was a big deal at the time, but and I'm sometimes a critic, but I have to say the governments today are not dealing with the occasional crisis. They're dealing with an unending stream of crises. Just think of the last 2 years. And I don't think people have gotten any smarter or more agile or more innovative in that time. And they're dealing with the same kind of limitations that we all felt as leaders in our own time. But the issues, every problem today is multidimensional. Every problem is solving a Rubik's Cube, far more complex, far more difficult than what we confronted. So I can't give one answer to why we are where we are. I think it's a whole combination of many things.
Gary, do you want to add into that, or do you want instead to make a last comment, a final comment?
Well, I agree with John, and as a former premier, I know how much pressure is on every premier in Canada, and of course how much pressure has been on the national government and the national cabinet ministers, and of course all across the world dealing with COVID. And one thing I think that's come out of it in general, not there's exceptions to this, too large exceptions, but a lot of people have listened in Canada to scientists. I think in the United States to listen to scientists when you look at the vaccine rates. Although, I think that relying on third parties to help you through these situations, I think has been very, very important. Yeah. And I would hope that in climate change, we can have, again, an informed debate with third parties playing a very important role, scientists as opposed to celebrities playing a very important role. I'm not a celebrity, so I can say that. And in these debates and the conclusions we reach. But it is, this is not a picnic to be in government now. It is a very, very trying time. And our leaders are under tremendous pressure, all our elected leaders. And I wish them all the best with the wisdom they'll need on our behalf. And I support them all in their endeavors on our democratic behalf.
Which is an opportunity to say we have great respect for our missing colleague, Jean Charest, who has been willing to throw himself back into it. And I wasn't given the opportunity to give him the advice that was given to me after I'd left government, which was lie on your back, breathe slowly anytime the urge comes to go back in, and in due time it'll pass. But good for Jean.
Yeah.
John Manley, Gary Dewar, I thank you both very much for giving us your time, your insights into making the political decisions, and I'm going to turn it right back over to Colin to close this off.
Well, thanks very much, Maureen, and thank you, Gary and John, for a sobering but realism-based discussion on the politics of managing values and trade and going beyond that. I couldn't help reflect when John talking about social media, a conversation I'd had recently with two other people who are associated with CJI and follow polls, and certainly Gary appreciate this, and that's David Coletto and Frank Graves, and they both said, in the world today, feelings trump facts. Well, I hope today what you got out of the state of trade was fact-based and arguments based on facts, because I think that's the only way we're going to get out of this. John, I take your point very much again on the need for Canada with relatively modest 2% GDP, but nonetheless moving in packs and leading in packs, but doing so in a way that we're not preaching and pontificating, which I think sometimes has been the temptation in the past. Gary, I as always appreciate your reminder that we are a federation and that the provinces play a critical role. And, as you underlined, the premiers, no matter separatist, socialist, liberal, conservative, actually, in my experience, like you, are much more committed to the practical side of trade than we sometimes appreciate, and are able to overcome, as you pointed out in the case of the procurement agreement in 2010, that with the governors that we couldn't achieve at the federal level. So again, our federation really is designed for purpose and fit for purpose. I also take on your point about use of labor, particularly with the United States in overcoming challenges. And that labor takes us back to something my friend John Weeks said about living standards, because to me, it's often labor who's been driving that forward. And I'll just simply conclude with, Gary, your observation of somebody we all like and admire, and that's Jean Charest, that when you paint yourself in a corner, walk over the paint. That's the great thing about, Jean Chrétien. Jean Chrétien's ability to sort of, the Team Canada concept that you spoke about, to me, that's what Canada is. And as Jean Chrétien said, just walk over that paint. I think we need to do more of that in Canada. Well, look, that concludes the CGAI's 5th annual look at the state of trade. My thanks to all our speakers today for making us all appreciate more the importance of trade and what's involved in trade, because it is so vital to our prosperity, taking us back to our very first session when Marie-France and David Morrison pointed out, that we really are, we are a trading nation, but we're also a nation of traders, but we don't trade enough, and we could do more there. I think we're all a little bit smarter on about some of the challenges we face, thanks to the panels. My appreciation, as always, to our ad hoc advisory council, many of whom are participated in today's conference, And my renewed thanks to our strategic sponsors, Lockheed Martin Canada and General Dynamics, and our conference sponsors, Amazon, UPS, and the Simon Reisman Chair in International Economic Policy at Carleton University. To conclude, I'm happy to report that CGI events will soon be back in person, pandemic willing. First, on May the 10th for the annual Canada in the World Conference, and then on May 19th for a North American Defense event. We hope that those of you who are at least in the National Capital Region can join us then, and look to CGI website for more details on that. For those of you who participated today or missed part of some of the sessions, we will be putting these out as podcasts on the Global Exchange, and Marie-France's deck, which really is worth another look, will also be posting on the deck. And with that, thank you especially to the person behind the scenes who makes this possible, the indispensable Charlotte Duval-Antoine, who's kept it all on track and running today. So with that, I conclude the 5th annual CJAI State of Canadian Trade.